It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Alan Aragon, the pioneer of evidence-based nutrition. I'm just going to rip through some things right here. The founder of the AARR journal. I guess that's what I call that, a research journal. Cool. I should probably know what it's really called a little better since I've been a subscriber since 2008 or something along those lines. Researcher, consultant, and author. A couple notes to kind of, with your author side point, the nutrition timing for JISSN was the most viewed.
That's
right?
Right. That's
and then the position stand for the ISSN, you did the diet and body comp, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then several ebooks, which we don't really need to talk that much about, but there's several ebooks and other books, and then flexible dieting, which just came out like a year ago?
A couple years ago.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, where I'm going with all this is when we're talking about, first we're going to talk about what evidence-based really means, because that's kind of being convoluted and destroyed and not destroyed and all that. So we'll talk about what evidence-based is, but when it comes to the evidence-based side of the nutrition, you're the guy. I mean, you've been the guy for a while and you've been doing this for ever. You know, I don't want to date you too much. So before we get into defining the evidence-based, your undergrad was in psychology, then your master's was in nutrition, correct?
That would have been cool. They're both in nutrition.
They're both in nutrition.
And I'm saying it would have been cool because psychology is just it's such a big part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
So if I got another freaking degree, I'd probably get it in psychology.
And then you started as a trainer. So
That's right.
How do you get to where you are now in a concise story?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is really good. Back in 2007, when EliteFTS actually had my first book in the catalog. It's now discontinued, so you wouldn't be able to have it in the catalog even if you wanted to. But that book, as you may remember, was titled Girth Control. And my point guy at the time was Jim Wendler. Good old Jim, who knows what he's doing right now. But okay, so that was 2007. And 4 years after that, I had already started my research review, which is this technical journal, which you mentioned, which kicked off all the other monthly research reviews in the space. And every once in a blue moon, Brett Contreras will give me credit for starting that thing. But so in 2011, I pulled a paper by Brad Schoenfeld, and it was a paper on fasted cardio. And I DM'd him actually on the bodybuilding.com forums. And I'm like, hey, Brad, do you mind if I pick your paper apart in my research review? And he's like, go for it. That's what keeps science honest. It's all about peer review. I'm like, oh, okay, great. Can you send me your paper? So he sent it to me and I picked it apart in my research review. And this was in 2011. And from that point on, that's what kicked off my career in the research world. So I was just kind of moving along my merry way, being a nutritional counselor. Prior to, 10 years prior, I was a full-time personal trainer, and then I had this 10-year stint.
Today's episode is brought to you by Element, a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything that you need and nothing that you don't. In other words, no sugar, no artificial coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, and no BS. With Element, I love the watermelon. The watermelon tastes freaking awesome. I drank 1 pack every day, no matter what. People that train out here, it's sitting out here for them all the time. The boxes don't last very long. Right now, Element is offering Table Talk listeners a free sample pack with any purchase. That's 8 single-serving packages free with any Element order. Get yours at drinkelement.com/Table Talk. The deal is only available through the link in the description. The other thing is, if you don't like it, you can just give it away to a salty friend and Element will give you a 100% refund. No risk, money back guarantee. Head over to drinkelement.com/Table Talk. Merrick Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to merrickhealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. merrickhealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk.
In nutritional counseling. And so kind of in the midst of that is when I made friends, made contact, and got in with the research circle through just knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, Brad, can I nitpick the heck out of your paper?" So he really liked the job I did, picking apart his paper on fasted cardio. I even found a mistake in the references. He's like, "Oh, okay, Alan's thorough. He's got OCD. I'm going to need him on my research projects." 30 papers later, man, here I am. And I've had the honor of working with almost all of the top guys in the nutrition research space, and it's all been by invite. It's been amazing. It's been a really interesting journey. And I would like to think that my take on things has the influence of experience with clients as well, and not just waving papers around and stuff like that.
So how would you define the evidence-based nutrition?
Okay, evidence-based nutrition is this. It's rooted back in the days of the beginnings of medicine. So there was evidence-based medicine, to where you just looked at which shaman was getting the best results for their witch doctoring. And then eventually we built this scientific research basis where the burning questions of health and wellness and medicine were answered through research. So, and the thing with research, you can really only look at one piece at a time, one question at a time. So there's always going to be this large expanse of gray area in the knowledge. So what evidence-based nutrition is, or evidence-based fitness, or evidence-based medicine, it's the combination of, hey, what do we know as far as the research evidence goes? And the gray area, what can we look at, what we've seen in the field that consistently works? And then we kind of cross-check those two areas against each other. And that's really what evidence-based fitness or evidence-based nutrition is. It's the research plus what we see in the field to kind of bridge the gap in those gray areas that the research either has not covered or will never feasibly cover. And there's a lot of that.
Where would you say people misunderstand the evidence-based? Like, so where's all the pushback to the evidence-based come from outside of just meatheads saying that's just bull crap because I've always done it differently? Yeah. Where does that pushback come from?
It comes from both sides, really, dude. A good example is protein. Well, how much protein do you need? So bodybuilders have been pushing a gram per pound since the 1980s, late 1970s. Thus far in the body of research, the community at large, the academic guys, the evidence-based guys, they have it stuck in their mind that 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight is all that's going to work because that's all the research shows. Well, the problem with the research is we haven't looked at advanced trainees much, and let alone advanced trainees running hypocaloric conditions for sustained periods of time. And there's a lot of at least observational evidence that these guys can benefit from protein amounts that are a gram per pound and up all the way to like a gram and a half. And typically when you look at the guys who are champing the contests, they're right in the gram to a gram and a half per pound range. So, Jim Rohn has this saying that's famous to self-help type of folks that says success leaves clues. And so sometimes we have to look at what the successful people are doing, because they're either doing stuff that is actually helping and optimizing, or they're doing stuff that at least isn't hurting them. And so you kind of roll the dice and take the chance and go, you know what? If it can't hurt and they're winning the championships and they're getting the results, well, then there may be some wisdom in there that they're engaging in that is not necessarily, in quotes, proven scientifically. So yeah.
All right, just stay on that protein topic. You got a book on it, and I've heard you in several lectures or podcasts just go deep into all this with the protein metabolism, protein timing, protein absorption, all that. So where's the easiest place to start with that? Because you have with RDA, then you have like a meathead RDA, so we have that. So here's X number of grams that somebody should have over a period of a day. But then things get really gray as far as that protein, how it's spread out, if it needs to be spread out, how long it stays in the bloodstream, if BCAAs or ECAs are even necessary, if all the other protein is in the bloodstream. So there's a lot of rabbit holes here. So start with the basics of just what protein does, right? Because many who are listening may not completely understand that and may think that it's just one thing, instead of the multi things that it can do.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, I'm waiting for when I'm going to start hallucinating. I had the equivalent of like 3 cups of coffee before getting here. And so I'm guessing this has like another couple cups of coffee in it.
Yeah, probably 200, maybe 200 milligrams, 300 maybe.
So, all right. So we kind of begin with the big picture. So with nutrition stuff, there's always the cake, and then there's the icing on the cake. Okay. So the cake, as far as protein goes, is how much protein are you getting by the end of the day? So when you hit that goal, you cover like 90 to 95% of what you need to cover. And then everything else, like the timing of the protein relative to training, the distribution of protein relative to specific points in the day, first thing in the day, at whatever point in the day, and then pre-bed, whatever. Those things are a distant secondary concern. So if we're looking at total daily protein, most of the evidence converges on about double the RDA. So the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Double the RDA is 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And in imperial terms, that's 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. That dose right there pretty much covers the benefits. It covers both health benefits, performance benefits, and it also covers potential clinical benefits as well. So if people are getting that as a minimum, then they've got it covered, that 0.7 grams per pound. As far as the icing on the cake goes, there's division of, okay, what's your goal? Is your goal more oriented towards growth, or is it more oriented towards just maintenance in like a dieting situation? So with the goal of muscle growth, then you really want to have a minimum of, I want to say, 3 protein feedings in the day. If you're, a little bit more elite and up, like possibly 4 and up feedings in the day. And if you are just dieting and your main goal is just holding on to muscle, then the distribution of protein through the day, per the evidence, with people just eating once a day, people eating every other day and still hanging on to lean mass, distribution doesn't matter a whole lot. Now, if you want to maintain an extraordinary amount of muscle, I would still go with that minimum of 3 protein feedings throughout the length of the day. However, it's less of a concern in dieting versus when you're trying to gain. So we've got this 3-dose paradigm as a minimum with protein feeding, since there's practical limits to eating all your protein in one meal. And then there's these theoretical limitations to potentially not getting as much out of each dose in terms of muscle protein synthesis and stuff. So with this goal being to maximize muscle protein synthesis by the end of the day, by the end of the week, by the end of the month, you'll get more out of that if you've got metered and relatively frequent dosing of protein throughout the course of the day. So, and that would be this theoretical minimum of 3 to 4 doses throughout the length of the day.
I can hear the average person saying now, though, but if I'm dieting and I've got less available fuel in my system, right, surely I need protein in my system more regularly to make sure that I'm not breaking down what's, that's what's probably going through people's heads right now. So why is that not the case?
What you said is really logical on paper, and this is pretty much what we assumed all the way up until, I want to say 2010 or something. But from 2010 onward, over the last decade-ish, there's been this pileup of intermittent fasting studies and this and an emerging literature on time-restricted feeding studies where they're squishing people's total daily food intakes into 8 hours-ish. And we've just begun to really look at resistance trainees who are squeezing their eating into an 8-hour window. And it's Grant Tinsley who's been doing the research in that area. So when we compare resistance trainees who are intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding, that variant of intermittent fasting, we compare them to a control group who's eating throughout the day, and especially when we optimize protein intakes in both groups, there's just really no difference in what happens with the muscle side of things with that kind of what we would think of as a suboptimal distribution of protein. And so there's been a replication of those types of studies in resistance trainees to the point where we have to say, maybe we don't need a state of hyperaminoacidemia through all our waking hours and at one point in the middle of the night in order to keep muscle while dieting. Yeah.
Because there was a theory, for a while where I think this was kind of maybe early mid 2010s, whatever, where it almost went the other way, thinking that keeping your amino acid levels high all the time might in fact be a bad thing, in that it's almost like having insulin high all the time, in that it would desensitize your body's anabolic response to the, I assume all that's been washed out at this point as well, where it's basically just, it's almost the area under the curve is the only thing that matters, I'm presuming, at this point.
Pretty much, man, pretty much. There's still hypothetical stops that people can pull. And I personally think, hey, it's fine if you want to pull out the hypothetical spots. But it really, with all the nutrition questions, everything comes down to who are we talking about? What's the population and what's the goal? And then maybe a third thing, what are the stakes? Are the stakes high? Yeah. Do you have to really look amazing at the apartment complex pool this weekend? Or are you trying to get gold instead of silver? Yeah. So what's the population? What's the goal? What are the stakes? And then really it kind of depends on how fancy and nitpicky optimal that you want to get, because there's levels you can go,
Yeah. For those who are on say a plant-based diet due to the bioavailability, then do the recommendations change in your opinion? If it's 1.6 grams per kilo, but on average plant-based protein is say 20% less bioavailable. Does that need to be taken into account, do you think? Or do you think all of that again kind of comes out of the wash 90% of the time?
What's the population and what's the goal? Yeah, it's like this. It's like, if you look at the general population, just let's say weekend warrior dads who want to look semi-decent, then it might not matter. But if you're a competitive athlete or a recreational athlete, or you just have really kind of high standards for yourself, let's say you're under 50 and you still care, then for that population, if you're going to wipe out all the animal food in your diet, you probably are disadvantaged 10 to 20% in terms of protein intake. And of course, my nerdy friends would point to a couple studies in the literature where they compared an omnivore diet with a vegan diet in resistance trainees. And as long as protein intake is 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, we have 2 studies now showing no differences between the groups in muscle size and strength gains. But, you're not looking at highly trained subjects here. And pretty much, with untrained subjects, you can compare any 2 things and they're both going to pretty much work the same just because of newbie gains and just because the nature of training, the impact of training is always going to have a much higher magnitude than what type of protein that you consume. But back to your question, I would say they're disadvantaged like 10 to 20%. So I would assign 10 to 20%, probably 20-ish% more protein for vegan subjects or athletes who want to be on par with the omnivores for potential for muscle growth.
Because at worst, it's going to do no harm, right?
Yeah. It's just a little extra step, a little extra freaking scoop of your vegan protein. And then, you'd be done with it.
Perfect.
Now, how long will it take if it's just protein, right, for it to actually get into the bloodstream?
Okay, so
because there's a digestion part here that I think gets left out a lot of conversations.
Right. So if you, for example, you have 40 grams of whey protein by itself, no other macronutrients, just bam, that bolus of 40 grams of whey protein takes about 45 minutes for your blood levels of amino acids, insulin, amino acids and insulin, and to a very, protein is not a glucogenic thing to any meaningful degree. So you're mainly looking at circulating amino acid levels. That's going to peak about 45 minutes after you take that individual bolus of protein.
And then how long will that stay peaked?
Okay, so the peak will happen at about 45-ish minutes, and that curve will kind of last and then come back down to baseline about 3-ish hours after.
If it's whey, right? If it's just whey.
That's right.
Now we throw fats in there. How does that change?
Ooh, okay, so, if you throw fats in there, that's going to flatten that curve out and draw it out longer. If you do a slow digesting protein like casein, for example, a 40 gram dose of protein, casein protein, pre-bed has been shown to keep amino acid levels even through the night, elevated throughout the night. You wake up, you still are in a mild state of hyperaminoacidemia. So yeah, there's different profiles to how proteins behave and how mixed meals behave. And generally speaking, a mixed macro meal with a decent hit of protein in there is going to have an anabolic effect of like, at minimum, like 4 hours up to 6-ish hours on average. So about 5-ish hours anabolic effect per meal.
So if it's whey with fats, how close does that come to the digestion of casein?
Ooh, I don't think that's ever been compared head to head. And that's a damn good question. And I honestly, I even think that there's some research showing that the inclusion of fat doesn't affect things too much. But I think that hypothetically, if we look at mixed macronutrient meals, you can pretty much count on it, I want to say, doubling the length of time that you remain hyperamino acid.
Well, I would think in the real world, or real strength athlete world, all meals are mixed macronutrients. So when these protein conversations kind of happen, in my brain, I'm like, you're missing something here.
Yeah.
With this is not just an isolate. You're not just living on protein shakes with 0 carbs and 0 fats.
Right.
There's other things that are going on there that may increase the time that it's actually in the bloodstream.
Sure.
So for the 3-meal hypothesis, I guess, for lack of a better term, the reason it would become 4 to 5 is just based upon the amount of food somebody would have to eat. If it's 5,000 calories, it's going to be a chore to put into 3 meals.
Yeah. That would be a big part of it, just the practical side. And there's also a bit of it that is this hypothetical side to where if you can maximize these muscle protein synthesis spikes a maximal number of times that you can in the day, then you would, in theory, maximize muscle growth over the course of the week and the month. So yeah, there's both of those things. There's the practical side, and then there's this theoretical side.
Is there, so like over time, there have been plenty of, let's say, like mini scaremongerings about higher protein diets, for example. So we're all here kind of like championing a higher protein diet and the benefits of it and all that type of thing. But are there any downsides, from whether it's a digestive health or a gut health, or even like maybe a special for certain populations, perhaps that need to be taken into account as opposed to just saying 1.6 grams per kilo blanket statement for everyone?
Yeah. The short answer to that is, for the most part, there's really no. Protein is the macronutrient where you'd be hard pressed to find the downside of overdoing it. It might be economically more expensive to overdo protein than if you were just to carb and fat up your diet. But all of the concerns about, the kidneys, or the liver, or the cardiovascular disease or whatever, all of that stuff is just, number one, the people who put that stuff out there, they don't even lift, number one. Number two.
It's an important factor.
Number two, the evidence just isn't there to support these concerns. Now, granted, a special case can be made for somebody with objectively diagnosed chronic kidney disease. So if they have pre-existing kidney disease, then you can build a case for, all right, you shouldn't be consuming a high protein diet. But then you have to think of trade-offs too. When you really start lowballing the protein, let's say going towards the RDA or even below the RDA for some people who are really scared of protein during kidney disease, you have to think of what kind of trade-off you're making, because everybody's eventually going to age and everybody's going to eventually want to protect against sarcopenic losses in muscle mass. And so what trade-off are you making to save your kidneys, in that respect? So it's a little bit of there's a tight rope to walk there sometimes.
And to be open, I didn't want to ask you that question, but it's still out there to a degree, that in some populations, like the fear of what higher protein intakes could do in terms of negative side effects. And it seems to be a very hard demon to get rid of in that regard, It's just been perpetuated since the 80s. And, my dear dietitian colleagues, they've been fed this by their professors for like 4 decades now. That, overproteinating is bad. Overproteinating is bad. Look, if there's any macronutrient that's not going to be bad to overdo, it's going to be protein, because fats and carbs are always either just practically or metabolically or behaviorally, they're going to be the most treacherous macros to kind of watch out for. And we see that on an experimental level. We see that at the population level. It's our population doesn't have a protein problem. Yeah, very true. And just sticking with protein just a little bit more, I'm sorry. Dave mentioned BCAAs, EAAs, and all of that.
Yeah.
As far as I've seen, at least in research, providing your protein is at a good level doesn't really seem to be any particular benefit to them. But the two things that I kind of see proliferating about them is, one, people still thinking of them as free calories or free protein because they're pre-digested, so they don't go towards my calorie intake, or that all of a sudden they become important when they're dieting down, even if their protein intake is still high. And I'm assuming there's still nothing now that's kind of illustrating that they're beneficial for muscle retention or anything like that.
It gets into a gray area. The ISSN, the International Society of Sports Nutrition, they just published a position stand on supplemental EAAs. And they illuminated some research and made some good points that you can take, like, let's say 20 to 25 grams of intact protein, like of whey protein, and compare it to like 6 grams of EAA, full spectrum EAA. And the full spectrum EAA will spike muscle protein synthesis just as much as the full 20 to 25 gram dose of whey, sometimes even more. So EAAs are very potent at eliciting this anabolic response, and they're even more efficient on a calorie per calorie, gram per gram basis than intact protein. So with EAAs, theoretically, if somebody has a tough time getting in, 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight, then they could be undershooting that and supplement their diet with 10 grams of EAAs and be getting and really making up for that kind of that gap in their protein intake. And so there's applications there for the elderly population. There's applications there also at the other end of the spectrum for, I guess, the bro and the competitive population who want to add that extra little bit of edge that we might not have been able to observe or track sensitively enough in research designs that involve regular old people.
Yeah. And this might be an impossible follow-up question, so I apologize if it is, but in that enhanced protein spike we're seeing with EAAs, in your opinion, is that due to the EAA or is that due to the leucine content of the EAA? In which case, could I get the same thing by just taking 2 grams of leucine as opposed to taking 6 grams of EAA, for example? Because that, for all intents and purposes, at least as far as we've seen, that seems to be the main driver of mTOR and all that type of thing, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I would have said the leucine thing theoretically, you can just sprinkle leucine on top of, let's say, an adequate amount of total daily protein. But there's 2 studies now looking at that 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight protein intake with extra leucine dosed on top. And there weren't any significant advantages seen in terms of muscle size and strength gain.
Okay.
Admittedly, that's 2 studies, and one of them didn't even necessarily, push for like a hypertrophy angle. So since we have those, it sort of gives me some doubts as to whether we can just do the leucine thing. So I personally, if you were to kind of play that angle, I would do the full spectrum EAA supplementation.
Because again, it can't hurt. Basically, you're still going to get the leucine anyway.
It can't hurt, and full spectrum EAA is something that could help people who are really trying to fill in those little gaps, and vegans can vegans who want to maximize muscle growth, that would be an option for them to engage in as well.
Post-training protein, right? So that's gone through its ebbs and flows where I don't know where it is now, like not important or important. I as far as the dialogue and the narrative around that. So what is the science that's there for that?
So this goes back to our conversation of the time course of circulating amino acids in the blood after you've consumed a bolus of protein. So if we know that there's this curve of, elevation in blood levels of aminos that lasts, 3 to 5 hours after a serving of protein, then when we look at the so-called post-exercise anabolic window, it's really like, okay, well, that's there. But what if you consumed a mixed macronutrient meal pre-exercise? That is going to be seeping through your bloodstream for another 3-ish hours at least. And so let's say if you trained an hour after you consumed this meal, then you still have elevated blood substrates like an hour after your training bout. So therefore, it's more practical to think about the so-called peri-workout period, which is the time frame between the pre-exercise meal and the post-exercise meal. And because that is going to be your kind of zone where you will be sort of I guess, anabolically primed, or as Will Brink said in like the 80s or 90s, priming the anabolic environment. And so yeah, it's more practical to think of that. So if you're somebody who trains first thing in the morning, you don't have time to have a pre-exercise meal or something, then that post-exercise period might be something that you want to consider, kind of getting your protein in, getting your carbs in, et cetera, to, begin that recovery period, begin that anabolic response. But if you're somebody who's training sort of in the middle of the day or, later on in the earlier part of the day, it's like if you had a pre-exercise meal, there isn't necessarily this anabolic opportunity post-exercise. So the practical thing to take away is the peri-exercise period, the period between your pre-exercise meal and your post-exercise meal. Try not to stretch it out beyond like 3 to 5 hours, and then you'll be just fine. My colleagues and I actually looked at that question, and we ran an experiment. It's published. You can look it up in PubMed, pre versus post-exercise protein, where we compared an immediate pre-exercise protein dose with an immediate post-exercise protein dose. And we looked at muscle size and strength gains. And there was no difference between the immediate pre and the immediate post. And our thinking was, if there was this post-exercise anabolic window to take advantage of, then potentially the way that you would nail it is by consuming protein immediately pre-exercise, since it takes almost an hour for blood amino acid levels to peak. So if you
would that take even longer though if you're actually training? Because if you're training, I'm assuming that's going to have some effect on your ability to digest because blood is moving to other areas that you're training.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily / who knows.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But in any case, we didn't see any difference in that. And it kind of comes back to the concept of the cake versus the icing on the cake. So nutrient timing, protein timing relative to training would be that thin layer of icing on the cake that you could opt to get right and get perfect. But, depending on the population, all you may need is the cake, All
right. So now with these protein requirements, are you basing those on lean body mass or are you basing those on body weight?
That is a great question. From a practical standpoint, it's tough to accurately assess people's body composition, period. And so, anytime we say Tom is 12% body fat, we're just making a wild guess, even if that was assessed with DEXA or assessed with BIA or some other method. A lot of these body comp measuring methods, their error margins are bigger than what you'd be able to detect in terms of changes in body fat in like a week. So, or a month even in some cases. So it's like this is what I do as far as estimating protein. Now, in theory, we should be basing protein intake on lean body mass. In theory, we should. But in practice, it's difficult to do it accurately. So we just kind of circumvent that by basing protein on your goal body weight or your target body weight, which serves as a proxy for lean body mass plus a little bit of margin of safety there.
Right. Then how would or not the protein intake change with the presence of PEDs and growth hormone?
Sure. Okay. So there's really no research on that because nobody wants to nobody wants to legally, the international review boards are not going to sign off on that. And so what we have to do is, again, kind of, with evidence-based, we've got the research data, and then we've got what we see in the field. So what I've seen in the field is that people on PEDs, they not only have a greater potential for ultimate levels of muscle growth, but their rate of muscle growth is higher as well. And so it's higher to the tune of I want to say 20% just to be safe. And so somebody who is enhanced, whatever you assign to a natty, just bump it up 20% for somebody who's enhanced.
Do you see that? Because you work with a lot of different clients and demographics. Do you see that difference between natural bodybuilding and enhanced bodybuilding?
Yeah, I do. Yes, definitely.
In that scenario where we're talking about just stepping back a little bit to, you're saying about basing protein intake off goal body weight. Obviously, in that scenario, we're primarily talking about overweight individuals who are looking to drop their body weight, right? Mm-hmm. So then would it also be fair to work that backwards and say, right, let's take PEDs out of the equation, but let's say we're someone who's considerably more muscular than average, right? For your 200-pound frame, you have considerably more lean tissue than average person. So therefore, maybe whereas overweight individual over here needs to go from 1.6 to 1.3, overly muscular, if there is such a thing, individual here needs to go from 1.6 to 1.8, for example. Would that be a fair way to look at it, in your opinion?
Theoretically, yeah. I mean, the protein doses that we see that work for one group versus another, we're painting with a really broad brush because some people are 50% body fat, and some people are 10-15% body fat. And so the 10 to 15% body fat, theoretically, you would be pushing their protein intakes per unit of total body mass higher in order to better reflect their higher proportion of lean mass.
Yeah, sure.
So would you say with any meal plan or dieting plan, I don't like the word dieting because people freak out about that, but any meal plan, it should always start with the protein first and then build out from there?
The way I do it is it's sort of a simultaneous thing. It's just protein and calories.
Yeah.
Protein and total calories, and then you fill in the rest with carbs and fat.
Yeah. My fault on that one. The calories matter. You can't just see like 9,000 grams of protein.
Well, I mean, but to that point, Dave, if somebody did, and I've seen this many times, if somebody just had a protein target in the day and that was their priority, they didn't even think about calories. I just got to hit my protein goal. It sort of auto regulates itself and defaults people into good results because hitting the protein goal, it satiates them.
Yes.
And so that kind of puts a top speed limiter on the rest of their macro intake. And it supports lean body mass better. It supports muscle tissue better. And it also, this hypothetical theoretical part, it's a more thermogenic diet, if you will.
Define satiation a little bit deeper than, because I've heard you define it before and it's covering all aspects where some people are just like, I'm full, right? So what exactly is satiation so people know what you're speaking about?
Yeah, sure. So satiety is the overall effect of a diet or of a nutrient to make you feel full, to basically control appetite. So that's what satiety is. So if we were to construct a low satiety diet, we would make it low protein, high in about an even amount of carbs and fat. And then we'd put some salt and some sugar in there with the carbs and the fat and the low protein, and we'd make it low fiber too. That would be a low satiety diet. So
are there psychological aspects that go into that as well?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, satiety, it's affected by people's, probably their childhood experience. I mean, satiety begins with just the visual of the meal, and even, the olfactory, the smelling of the meal and all that. It kind of begins there. And so unintuitively, you really would need to be satisfied by a meal in order for it to have a maximal satiating effect. And being satisfied by a meal, it means like it's got to be enough just volume wise, just bulk wise. And it also has to taste good. But there's limits to that. But you have to have enjoyed the meal to a certain degree for it to be satiating. It's not always this thing where we got to make it bland and we have to make it like a a bodybuilding contest prep style meal, and then that's really satiating. There's a psychological aspect to that too, where if you just ate some, let's say, chicken breast and green beans and a sweet potato with a little bit of a little bit of spices on there. That's theoretically that's a satiating meal, but psychologically you're like, God damn, like soon after you ate it. And so there is definitely a psychological element to satiety.
Does that extend then to eating habits as well? As in eating in front of a TV and on your phone or in a distracted state? Does that cause then less satiation as well, in your opinion?
Yeah. No doubt about it. No, the mindless eating phenomenon was covered really well by Brian Wansink. And he has a book called Mindless Eating. And when you just sort of engage in the way Westerners in the developed world engage and use food as just a way to kind of entertain themselves or celebrate things, or just in a ritualistic eating type of way, and certainly eating in front of the screen, or just eating like in Netflix, and you have just a bag of something in front of you. That can definitely be an issue, and satiety cues kind of go out the window because you're pretty well distracted.
Yeah. So even that can be, for someone who is dieting, that can be something that could maybe make a significant difference to their ability to adhere to a diet, maybe if they're in deficit.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
That can be a weird one, because you can look and say, eating alone may not be the best thing, because you don't have correspondence, dialogue, and stuff like that. But if I'm having dinner with friends and it's a 2-hour dinner, I'll tell you or Thanksgiving, over the period of the day, and there's food always there, I'm probably eating twice the calories I normally would if I was just the hermit eating it alone at home. So it's a weird balance.
It is. And you know what? It just takes a certain degree of awareness. You're either, you either are chasing a certain goal that's a priority, or not really. You know what I mean? And there's a big spectrum of where people stand on that prioritization of the goal, a physical goal.
That kind of plays into the message I sent you last night, is with most of the people who are listening to this podcast, it was on one of the past podcasts that we were talking, I kind of defined them as, they train like strength athletes, but live like Gen Pop. Right. And that's the majority. And so they think the goal is higher than what the goal really is, but it's not, because of the lifestyle, the Gen Pop lifestyle that they're living, with how they eat, rest, and all those other type of things, where when they're analyzing themselves, I think they need to look at that, because they want to deep dive into like, what exercise do I need to do to get my bench stronger? The low hanging fruit type things, instead of, I live like my mom and dad, as far as how I eat, but expect the gains of an IFBB pro or a pro power lifter. And they're not making it come full circle. Or when they do try to add in those other elements, they go to a pro bodybuilder type diet, or some very restrictive type diet that's not very flexible, and then fail, right? Because the bro's telling them chicken and rice, beef and rice, or turkey and rice, or whatever else in rice, and maybe instead of rice, sweet potatoes.
If you're lucky.
I mean, it's a short list that kind of goes through there. And with a more flexible type of approach, I don't think they feel or are being told they're going to get the same results. So they don't bother with that.
Yeah.
And your book, and basically everything that you say is, well, yes, you can. Yeah. And actually, you may not even need, the super restriction in the first place.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I want to go there yet. I want to go to carbohydrates next. So I want to cover the macros first.
Great.
Before we tie it all together. So with the carbohydrates, that's an interesting one, especially, over the last 3 decades, how we've seen that pendulum just swing back and forth and back and forth. And again, on that one, I don't even know where it is now. It's probably kind of, would you say it's more centric right now with the carbohydrate?
Yeah, kind of ish.
I mean, it was.
Although
I mean, if we go back a few years, it was low, right? And there's very strong proponents of the low, right? And they're never going to go away. But I don't know how loud those voices are now.
It's that pendulum. I'm telling you, it's still swinging.
Well, it still swings.
It's so swing, and there's different things that get introduced, like the rise of the carnivore diet. So I brought that pendulum back down to low carb, and so it's swinging.
All right. So why do you need carbs? Let's just go there first. Simple, complex, basic nutrition here. Why does somebody need to have carbs?
Okay, so...
And you can change the word need.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
They may not.
So different populations and different goals, if you have any sort of performance-oriented goals, then undercarbing or really restricting your carbohydrate intake is going to impact that. So, for example, there's really no high-level Olympic athletes ketoing their way through the Olympics. And that's for very specific physiological reasons. Now, on the other hand, there are exceptions here and there. Yeah. Zach Bitter is a really cool dude, actually. And I've spoken to him at length. He periodizes his carb intake, but it's low most of the time. But, by and large, if you underdo your carbs, you're going to be underdoing athletic performance. It's just the kind of the long and the short of that. Now, if you don't have athletic performance goals and you undercarb, you carb restrict, you're going to be suboptimizing things if you have muscle growth goals. Like if your goal is to take up as much space as possible with lean body mass, that's just not going to happen on just chronic linear keto dieting. And some people get really mad when I say that the muscle growth process is suboptimized on keto, because they'll be like, hey, I'm on keto, I'm jacked. I'm like, okay, cool, great. Are you, are you going to be competing? Are you trying to become world class, or are you just, trying to stay jacked and this is the way that you like to eat? There's different levels and different goals.
Is that being compromised because the protein is essentially being converted into an energy source, or is it being compromised by other mechanisms?
That would be one of the mechanisms, protein being a very inefficient source for energy. However, it's like you'll carry less glycogen within the muscles at rest, even at rest. Every unit of glycogen that you carry in the muscles has about 3 to 4 units of water attached to it. And so, like, even when you look at bodybuilders dieting for competitions, they'll characterize themselves as really flattened out and stringy until they carb up. Mm-hmm. And so it's that kind of phenomenon where you have lower resting muscle mass levels. And then there's the performance aspect of gaining size and strength. I mean, it requires this escalation of lifting volume, lifting capacity. And that is not supported, certainly not optimally, with keto levels of carb intake chronically and in a linear fashion. And so, sort of simplifying my answer to your question, why do we need carbs? Number one, if you have performance goals, you need them. Number two, if your main goal is muscle growth, you need the carbs to support escalating training demands. And some sports have a mix of things. Like, I mean, what high-level strongman training person do you know just linear keto all the way through? What world-class level of even like CrossFitters? How many of them are linear keto with high-level CrossFit? Weekend warriors kind of doesn't matter, but competitive athletics, it does matter. Maximizing muscle size, it does matter. Okay, so now we go over to the department of who doesn't really need this sort of minimum amount of carbs. It's anybody who doesn't have a primary goal of performance or muscle hypertrophy. So I could kind of take or leave the carbs thing. If you enjoy keto, if it helps you stick to your diet better to just be keto, you can still gain muscle on keto. It won't be to the optimal rate and degree as if you were to optimize your carb intake. Can you still perform athletically on keto? Yes, you can, but you're not going to be kicking anybody's ass in the world-class levels. So it's kind of like
so with the protein, we spoke about the timing of the protein throughout the day. How does that work with the carbohydrates?
Okay, so with certain people's goals, if so, what population would we be talking
like
about?
A strength athlete.
Yeah, with a strength athlete, any training bout that you push significantly past an hour, like intensive straight through, you will benefit from having a certain minimum amount of carbs going into the training bout. So if you take like the regular weekend warrior who's going to do, 6 to 8 sets of curls and 6 to 8 sets of lateral raises, and then call it a workout, then the carbs are really not an issue beyond, okay, like, did you get it in by the end of the day? But somebody who is a strength athlete, somebody who is competitive in any manner, then theoretically, if you're pushing higher volumes of training, then pre-fueling the bout is going to matter. And certainly if somebody's training more than once in the day and they're training the same muscle group at more than once in the day, then post-exercise carbs are going to play a role too in resynthesizing glycogen to make sure that the second training bout isn't shitty.
So where would intra fall in?
Okay, so intra, if they have a like a higher volume training bout that pushes them like 60 to 90 minutes-ish at least, and they don't have this nice pre-exercise meal in the morning, let's say they're training like first thing in the morning, then intra would help that scenario. And hypothetically, regardless of when the training bout happens, if you're training intensively for more than an hour, and certainly towards 90 minutes-ish or beyond, intra may work regardless of that. And so a classic catch-all intra type of formula would be somewhere between 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour of training and 5 to 10-ish grams of EAAs per hour of training would, and then, you could get cute and make sure you have a certain amount of sodium in there, half a gram to a gram per hour. And then you have your classic catch-all intra that, it might help, certainly won't hurt. It'll help people drive hydration during the training bout, and it'll kind of cover your bases if you have that kind of training intensiveness and volume.
Now, will the carb source matter if it's intra?
The answer to that is odd because carbs are a strange thing. Your body has certain transporters at the cellular level for carbs. And if you just have like a single type of saccharide in there, like just glucose, then in theory, that's not going to empty into the system, so to speak, as quickly as if you had glucose and fructose, where you're using multiple transporters to get this stuff into the system. So the combo of glucose and fructose in a roughly even-ish proportion, and you can nitpick and say a 2-to-1 proportion of glucose and fructose. You can nitpick that.
Yeah.
But basically, just regular old sucrose or whatever's, whatever they have in Gatorade, which is essentially sucrose, 50-50 split of glucose and fructose, that's going to be optimal for intra. But there's also research showing that this doesn't matter unless your training bout lasts longer than an hour of just intensive, exhaustive work.
Yeah.
So sort of the short answer to that, Dave, is yeah, there is a way that you can optimize carbohydrate intake, and it would be through multiple transportable carbohydrates, a combination of glucose and fructose, roughly at a 2-to-1 ratio.
Mm-hmm. When the whole intra-workout kind of peri-workout window kind of like took off, I guess one of the biggest mistakes I would say that I saw people do would actually be overdoing the intra-workout carbs and getting like reactive hypoglycemia, right? So
Nice.
for people who've made that mistake, what would you put the upper cap on? And also I think an important part of that intra thing is what kind of dilution are you looking for? Because, you know, some people will put that whole 60 grams into something that size and be like, I can't drink my intra. My stomach's bloated as hell. This carb powder doesn't suit. Well, it's not the carb powder. That's the, so, you know, like if you don't mind just kind of breaking that down, like why that hyporeactive glycemia can happen if you overdo it, and like how you should probably dilute it to make sure you're actually absorbing the stuff you put into your gut rather than pulling water into your gut.
Yeah, reactive hypoglycemia is really an odd thing. You can't really, it's hard to predict, and thankfully it's not a common thing. But for some people, it would help them for the solution of like for every liter or so, you would want to run the 30 to 60 grams of carbs in there for roughly every liter. So that would make it like a 10 to 20% solution.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it doesn't taste like soda then is the problem.
That's right. Yeah. And my math could be a little bit off. It might be like a little bit closer to 10-ish%. But yeah, that's how you would want to run it. And like just take Gatorade, for example. That is roughly a 10% solution of carbohydrate in with the fluid. And that has been shown to be sort of the optimal proportion. Yeah. So in theory, you know, an optimal intro would be adding EAAs to a Gatorade.
And is that just to keep nitrogen levels up, or is that due to some kind of co-transporter absorption?
That's a good question. It would mainly be to kind of push the hyperamino acidemic angle, and under the pretense that there would be some sort of a threat to amino acid availability or, you know, muscle protein breakdown if the training bout is long enough and intensive enough. And this is all theoretical stuff. It really, it's all hypothetical. And I mean, they've tested marathon type, like ultra running situations where you have 3 hours of running, and they examined whether adding EAAs to the mix prevented markers of muscle protein breakdown, and it didn't. But once again, you know, we're trying to push the growth and recovery angle. It won't hurt. It might help, and it contributes to the overall total. So it's an opportunity to feed. So if you look at optimizing nutrition for athletic purposes, you're looking for opportunities to feed. If you have it there, just take it. Yeah.
And you mentioned the sucrose or glucose fructose mix being like the theoretical optimum kind of carbs, or at least right now, as far as we understand. So like right now, the kind of carb choice that's kind of in vogue, if you like, for intra-workout would be cyclic dextrin. So in your opinion, or in the research that's been done, what, if any, advantages does something like that give over, say, sucrose, especially considering most people are going to be looking at cyclic dextrin saying it's 15 times the price or whatever it might be. What am I getting for that price point compared to Gatorade powder, for example?
Okay, so cyclic dextrins and things like like Vitargo, for example, these high molecular weight types of carbohydrates. The whole point is to get it, make it empty from the stomach as quickly as possible, so it's not in quotes sloshing around in there, and so it gets into the system and to the target tissues. So like performance, a lot of performance maneuvers are to just minimize the chance of gastric distress during training. And so with cyclic dextrins, if somebody actually can train better because of, a much better gastric type of effect, then, more power to them. It might be worth the extra money. But, you really would be nitpicking.
There's not much past that.
You really would be.
I mean, how much faster are we speaking that digestion's going to be?
Right. In the literature, you look there's things as much as, okay, it empties from the stomach 50% faster, roughly around there. I think I could have seen more than that, but it's a significantly faster gastric emptying.
But if that's the effect that I want to get it out of my stomach faster, I could also, in theory, maybe go for like a gel. Yeah, like cyclists use and that type of thing. In theory, that could do the kind of the same thing in terms of having less volume here. Less volume,
yeah. It could. Okay. I mean, there's caveats there and issues there, and ultimately, when you're a competitor, you sort of try these different things and see what works for you personally best. I mean, some people can be freaking cycling eating a potato, and that's how they that's how they do it. So with a lot of these options, it is just a matter of sort of effing around and finding out.
Would refined sugar be faster?
That would fall into the sucrose category. And so you're looking at, an even split of glucose and fructose hitting those transporters. So in theory,
So with the carb dosing throughout the day, how would carb cycling play in to this?
Okay. This is one of those good questions that has such a disappointing answer, Dave. Carb cycling, if you're not using it to position your larger carb days on high training volume days with a certain amount of endurance demand in the training bout, if you're not using it for that, then all it's going to work for is just a psychological benefit that could help people adhere to their diets. So carb cycling, when you use it for that purpose, the best way that it works is if you're running a low carb intake in general. So for example, if somebody has like a low carb intake, like let's say 50-ish grams a day or even up to 100 grams a day, still kind of low for some people. For that low carb intake, then cycling the carbs is going to make you at least feel like you're not restricting on, let's say, half of the week, 2 to 3 days out of the week. You'll feel like, okay, I'm not dieting. I'm not, chomping at the bit through this diet. So carb cycling is much more of a psychological benefit than it is some sort of hormonal benefit or whatever other benefit that people claim, if you're not using it for performance goals.
And for those who are, say they have a reasonably high amount of carbs in their diet, but they are, say, concerned or looking to keep track of their A1C, resting glucose, all that type of thing, does meal frequency play a matter in that? Does GI or glycemic index play a matter in that? All else being equal in that, I have 400 grams of carbs a day and that stays the same. Do those things actually have any meaningful impacts on that?
Yeah. On sort of diabetes and pre-diabetes, the threat of that kind of thing. Okay, the short answer is not if your total amount of calories you eat in the day is marching you towards an accumulating excess of body fat that would even make those things an issue.
Yeah.
So if somebody is, let's say they're staying lean, they're staying physically active, and the overall quality of their diet and their food sources and stuff is good. It doesn't matter if one guy is having let's say their 200 grams of carbs in one hit in the day versus having, 50 grams of carbs in 4 meals of the day. the body is just smarter than that. It'll handle both scenarios.
Yeah. So you're not compromising your long-term insulin sensitivity, for want of a better term, in any way with what you just do whatever strategy works best for you.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Under the pretense that we're talking about not an overabundance of total calories by the end of the day, end of the week. Mm-hmm. And you brought up a good question with glycemic index. Mm-hmm. This has actually been examined. There's a bunch of glycemic index research showing that, okay, low glycemic index and low glycemic load diets are the way to go for health and stuff like that. But when you take two groups and you equate the amount of protein they consume, you equate the amount of calories, and you equate the amount of fiber, the glycemic index of the carbohydrate within those two diets, if it's one's high, one's low, nothing matters in terms of body composition and clinical outcomes. Mm-hmm. So one guy can be low GIing it with his with his sweet potatoes on one side, and another guy can be high GIing it with his white potatoes on the other side. And then it literally won't matter in terms of HbA1c, etc. Yeah.
Is there an argument to be made there for satiety, do you think? Or do you think the protein and the fiber, so long as they're in line, just makes that almost a moot point and not really just negligible?
Pretty much just negligible, but I would always default to, how does the individual respond to that? Because people will always have differences in what satisfies them and what really works for them. So it's really hard to issue these universal types of recommendations.
Fats next on the agenda, right? So with athletic diets, we've seen low fat, high fat. That's another one that kind of bounces around. Protein kind of always stays, as its base, pretty stable. But fats are, on one side, demonized, then on the other side, not. So what's the story on that?
Yeah, fats are another double-edged sword. Since the 1980s, we've been demonizing one fat or another. It used to be saturated fats are the devil. And now the internet narrative is, polyunsaturated fats are the devil. The seed oils are the devil. Mm-hmm. And then people get real nitpicky and real reductionistic, and they point to certain fatty acids. This type of fatty acid is the devil. Like linoleic acid, that's the devil. And so it gets really weird, man. It gets really weird. I think people get away from the concept of, a fatty acid, a type of fatty acid is not the food that contains it. You have to look at the food and in quotes, the matrix effect. The food matrix is really what counts. Are we looking at, chugging down a liter of cottonseed oil on your spare time, or are we looking at somebody who's consuming, just like some nuts, for example? And so it comes down to food source. We have to kind of pan back and see, does this food source show with relative consistency favorable health outcomes in the research evidence? If it does, who cares what kind of fats it has? There are certain things that have risen to the surface as very consistent, like, for example, the general population, the general public, especially in the Western world, does not consume enough omega-3 fats to optimize health. So we either have to proactively eat more fatty fish, or we supplement somehow to get that in, to optimize it. The general population tends to eat too much saturated fats from the wrong sources. And so, we should proactively seek out, in quotes, healthy sources of unsaturated fats like nuts, extra virgin olive oil, avocados, etc. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of lower your risk for your ticker blowing up somewhere down the line.
So then where would red meat play into that?
Yeah, that's a juicy question. Okay, so the problem with red meat is that it's usually a guilt by association thing. People who, so populations who eat a lot of red meat, they tend to be more affluent. They tend to have a more sedentary lifestyle. They tend to eat other, in quotes, risky foods or junk foods along with their red meat intake. They tend to drink a lot more alcohol. And so, they tend to, run a little more risky body composition and lifestyles that are just not very physically active. And so red meat tends to get a bad rap in that respect. Red meat is one of these foods where if you look at all of the evidence, then you would conclude that two things can be true at once. Red meat is a highly nutritious food source in terms of essential macronutrition and essential micronutrition. Okay, that's true. Now, the other thing that's true is that it's also associated with a higher cardiovascular risk, higher mortality risk. And so with those both things being true, then we have to look at why is this? And so one of the hypotheses is that there is this divergence of effects with red meat depending on how you prepare it. So the people who are, charring the crap out of it and just consuming the charred parts as well as everything else, and people who consume fatty red meats, who are just downing the fat associated with it and all that, they're getting, they're raising cancer potential. They're raising adverse changes in blood lipid, the potential for that with the saturated fats in that meat. And they're sort of incurring that double whammy. And, there's other theoretical things going on with that. So that's one track. And then the other track of people, they're consuming fresh red meat that's relatively lean and they're not charring the heck out of it. If you go that track, then you are significantly cutting your risks for cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. The major health agencies have settled on this red meat limit that's supposedly, going to make everybody grow wings and be merry for their whole life. And that limit is roughly 17 ounces a week or 2.5-ish ounces a day. You limit it to that, then you'll have this perfect life and you'll be 20% richer and everything.
That left-hand track you mentioned there with the cooking method.
Yes, sir.
Could you not?
That includes buttering your meat.
Yeah. So could you not just take chicken thighs and say the same thing, that then chicken is the devil? If you eat nothing but fried chicken thighs with all the fat content in there and you deep fry them, do you know what I mean? You can turn anything good or bad depending on how you prepare it, almost, in a way. That's
a great point. And I think that's a perfect analogy.
And do you think a lot can be said then, that can almost be said for a lot of the oils that we see demonized is, quite often the cooking method or how they're used sometimes is the problem as opposed to them as just a constituent oil.
That's exactly right, Tom. Even with the vegetable oil thing, the seed oil thing, it's like what we're looking at that causes harm is seed oils used in your local diner where they're deep frying stuff over and over with the same oil. And so
you could take any oil and do that and there you go. Yeah,
pretty much. I mean, like the more saturated a fat is, the less susceptible it is to oxidation and these harmful oxidation products. But I mean, butter on its own will screw up your blood lipids without you even having to cook it, without you even having to heat it. And I'm not an anti-butter person by any means, but the research is what it is. In that.
To mirror Dave's question about carbs, those who may look at like prepping physique athletes and stuff, we've mentioned the chicken breast, green beans, and white rice or whatever. Obviously, that's not a particularly sustainable strategy for long-term health in most cases. So for most people, if they maybe are concerned about fat intake, what would you say is kind of a threshold people shouldn't be going below? And obviously there's variation with everyone here, but how much in reality do we need to actually maximize our hormonal health and all that type of thing?
That's one of these questions. That's a good question because it's an important question, but it's also one of these questions that hasn't been definitively or systematically investigated in the literature, in the research literature. So what we do know is that there's this repetition of studies comparing 20% fat diets versus 40% fat. And in the 20% fat conditions, testosterone production is significantly lower than the 40% fat conditions. And this is not necessarily due to lower calories in the 20%, mind you, because these studies, they equate calories and there isn't a significant amount of weight loss that happens by the end of them. So there seems to be somewhere between 20 to 40% that would make a difference. And certainly you could hypothesize if somebody goes below 20% fat in terms of total calories, then they are not going to be maximizing testosterone production. So it seems to be that like this, if we're just go with the evidence, yeah, you probably wouldn't want to dip much below 20% if maintaining optimal androgen levels is something you care about and you're not getting them exogenously.
Yeah. And I presume there would probably be other downside, like skin or hair health or something like that. You'd probably get, like external symptoms if it was too low for too long, perhaps.
Yeah, totally, man. And it's like this too. Like how important is it to the individual to maximize androgen levels? Some guys care about that more than others. There's observational research on certain populations taking in really low amounts of fat, like chronically, 20%-ish or even lower, and their health is good. But depending on the individual, me being one of them, you may want to maximize your natural androgen production. So I personally, just as a matter of like protocol maneuver and hedging my bets in the right direction, I'm not going to go below 20%. Yeah,
for sure. And whilst we're talking about the fats, and I think maybe a good one to cover would be what is an actual keto diet then, if we're talking about higher fat intake? Because a lot of people do keto, inverted commas, right? And think it is and they're not, so on and so forth. So if that is something that someone chooses to do or wants to do, what is an actual keto diet that leads to ketosis? And so, because, most people more probably get it wrong than get it right, I would probably say.
Yeah. So like technically, a state of ketosis is if you can get your ketone blood levels to at least 0.5 millimoles, so millimoles per liter, 0.5. And some people would argue that, you got to get it towards 1.0 millimolar in order to be truly in ketosis. But either way, most people get there by limiting their total daily carbohydrate intake to 30 to 50 grams. Some people would insist 30, but the majority would say 50 grams a day or less. And then you're running a decent state of ketosis.
So where does the protein need to fall in that with the fat content? Because I assume if you go too high on the protein, you can get gluconeogenesis maybe and push up that indirect carb intake, and then maybe you're not in ketosis because of that. Yeah,
that's another good question too. So there was this assumption when Jeff Volek and Steve Finney wrote their book back in, a few decades back, they insisted that you cut your protein intake off at like 1.2-ish grams per kilogram, 1.5 at the most-ish, in order to not, in quotes, get kicked out of ketosis. But then a bunch of other research came through by Lewis Burke and them, who saw that protein intakes even close to a gram per pound still allowed a decent level of ketosis in the subjects. So what we do know per the evidence is that you can still be consuming a gram of protein per pound of body weight and running at 50 grams of carbs a day or less, and you'd still be in ketosis. What we don't know is whether you can run 3 or 4 grams per kilo of body weight with protein and how that would impact it, but you can at least go a gram per pound.
And in your experience with things like keto and intermittent fasting, obviously when we go low carb, or whether it's as a whole dietary strategy or for say 16 hours out of the day, low blood sugar, usually high adrenaline and high cortisol, makes them feel energetic, right? That's usually people will go keto or intermittent fasting for a week or two, and the most common feedback you'll get is, I have so much energy, right? How much of that initial, because that's like a honeymoon period, right? That kind of doesn't last forever.
Sure.
How much of that do you think causes the buy-in to those diet strategies in the long term? Do you understand? Like, they feel that initial, that creates an initial positive feedback loop. And then even if things go a bit south after that point, they've already kind of decided this is the diet for them. And then they go on further. Do you think that is at least partly explains people's affinity with those diets who kind of stick to them?
I think it definitely does. But if you take a group of people, and you do a survey of who had buy-in, just mental and sort of like who has been sold on the idea beforehand, you'll see that it's most of those people who were already sold on the idea beforehand who actually had a certain level of confirmation / expectation bias going in. And so when they get those types of effects, it's just much more amplified in those individuals versus taking somebody, just kidnapping somebody and putting them on like keto or IF and say, you have to endure this, you have to adhere. A lot of them are really going to complain about, the opposite types of things.
Sure. So do you think, and again, how do you study this, but maybe in your personal opinion, is there any truth to the idea that maybe for some individuals going very low carb or keto, we're talking populations who've been maybe overweight for very long periods of time, haven't been in a calorie deficit for forever, that going into a diet strategy where they have to mobilize fat and use it as fuel is a tool for helping, not sure what the term would be, but, say like poor fat mobilizers, people who actually maybe on a physiological level or an enzymatic level don't have the machinery to break down body fat very well. Do you think that has any benefit to individuals who've in that population maybe chronically overweight for a long period of time to get them going? Or do you think that's kind of just smokescreen stuff?
If you were to look at the population who has a high degree of obesity, and at sort of the literature overall, it shows that with that population, rapid initial fat loss is associated with better long-term weight loss maintenance.
Is that just because they bought in better, though?
I think it's more of a psychological buy-in rather than physiological phenomena, which you mentioned. Yeah. So that's what I would think is the case.
To me, it's almost like the fasted cardio argument. It's like, is it making you burn more fat, or is that just when you do it and you believe in it more? So you do it more, and then funny enough, it works, if you get what I'm saying.
Right. I think that when you do that, like fasted cardio, it adds an element of structure in your program. And when that's in place, you tend to not want to, in quotes, screw that up with messing up your diet in the subsequent hours in the day. And so, in fact, my colleagues and I, we ran a fasted cardio versus fed cardio study in women, and there were no differences in body comp improvements in both groups. But you know what? We kind of expected that because with fasted cardio, you are burning more fat during the training bout. But with fed cardio, if both of the diets are equated between the groups, with fed cardio, you're burning more fat in the hours after. So it comes out the same. But with a lot of people, getting that fasted cardio session done in the morning means it gets done. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
In the study that you did, when you say there was no difference, was that no difference or statistically no difference?
Statistically.
Because the only reason I mention that, and I can't remember your study, so I apologize for that, but there was a similar study by, I think it was Chen.
Yes.
And They got the same conclusion, and to me, it looks like a reasonably well thought out study. You might have, I think it was a 6-week intervention, and at the end of the study, the fasted cardio group, I think it was 1.8 pounds more fat in 6 weeks, but that came to statistically not significant.
Yes,
which I get, because you have to, we're in a way, you have to do your statistics, and that's the governing rule for a lot of these things. But if you told an IFBB pro in those 6 weeks you could lose 1.8 pounds more fat if you did it fasted versus non-fasted,
he'll take the fast.
They'd snap your hand off, right? So I guess that's always an overarching theme in science, is what's statistically significant reality, and then in reality, is it significant to who? That 1.8 pounds might not mean anything to 99% of the population, but I just thought that was an interesting aside, because to someone somewhere that result is significant, if you get what I'm saying.
Well, I totally get it. The absolute differences favored the fasted cardio. Now, here's where we can go down a rabbit hole. There's some new research showing that pre-cardio protein intake, even up to 40 grams immediately before you do the morning cardio, there is no difference in fat oxidation during training with the, and even, and in absolute terms, it's minuscule, between a protein-fed cardio session versus a totally fasted cardio session. So if you wanted to really kind of push that envelope, protein-fed cardio might be superior to fasted cardio, because again, you're taking advantage of an opportunity to feed, and you're also, to whatever minuscule degree for this competitor, you're reducing the chances that they're sacrificing any kind of muscle protein for their cardio session, and they're burning the exact same amount of fat during the session.
So for average intermittent faster meathead whatever population, could we take that in theory and say, well, actually that makes us favor, what would be called like a protein sparing modified fast, or like what's used in obesity weight loss study? Could you then make, well, you can, if you wanted to word it gimmicky, right, you could say, well, the protein doesn't knock you out of the fasted state because your fat oxidation hasn't dropped, right? So could there be an argument to be made that actually those people who are fasting could potentially get better results, or better muscle retention, or better growth from doing a protein sparing fast?
Yes.
And that's right. Okay, good.
Actually, yes. And this reminds me of, and I know we're going off here.
Yes.
No, that's good.
There's a literature mainly led by a researcher named Krista Verity on alternate day fasting. And so the fasting days in alternate day fasting are really not true fasting days. It's basically 500 calories of kind of whatever. It's like a small meal or a snack or something like that. If we were to take that model and just freaking protein the heck out of those fasting days, then in theory, you could optimize the effects of this alternate day fasting model, or even the, in quotes, the 5-2 fasting model, where you have 2 fasting days. And even in the 5-2 research, they still do it like it is a modified fasting day where you have about 500 calories. Make them protein. And then you, in theory, can optimize the preservation of muscle mass throughout that dieting phase.
So as far as we know and can see, there is no benefit to doing a complete fast, at least for an active training individual, as opposed to doing a protein-fed fast, for want of a better word.
If you were to compare those two protocols, I would go with the protein. I would, and you can even apply that to time restricted feeding type of models, or 1 meal a day type of models. If somebody insisted on having like 1 meal a day, dude, just down a protein shake at some other point in the day, at the opposite point in the day. And then you're at least hedging your bets in the direction of better muscle preservation. Because
there are going to be, let's remove the fasting bias here now. There are going to be serious trainees out there who work shifts, maybe they're firemen or nurses or CEOs, whatever, who, for whatever reason cannot sit down and eat for 12 hours a day or whatever it might be. So in theory, they can undo perhaps a lot of the negative impacts of that just from having a couple of protein shakes throughout that day. And in theory, as long as all the macros equate, they're probably 90%. They've got their cake, to use your analogy there, probably in most scenarios.
That's right.
So it doesn't have to be, oh, well, I can't diet successfully because of X shift pattern, or whatever it means. You can still get most of the benefits and all of that from doing it that way. And
even in theory, 5 to 10 grams of EAAs will have the same effect as a 20 to 25 grams hit of protein. So if they really want to feel like they're pushing that fasting angle, then you could use EAAs for that. So
awesome.
The fourth macronutrient would be alcohol.
Yeah.
Right. So let's touch on that one. Then we'll pull it all together.
Yeah. The fourth horseman.
Yeah, the fourth horseman. Yeah.
Alcohol is a monster on its own. It's a force of nature, literally and figuratively. It makes and breaks people. So 1 in 10 people in the general population has an issue with alcohol. So technically, they have some degree of alcohol use disorder. So 1 in 10 people in any given room has a freaking problem. And that's kind of a bad problem from a public health perspective, because you never know. You never know who is going to develop a problem. So yeah, it's definitely a risk even starting.
So with those that are incorporating in their diet, right, the first thing is to, are you that 1 in 10?
Yeah.
Right. Because if you are, there's bigger issues that can come down the line.
Yeah.
But if you're not, then, there's the proponents of you need a little alcohol because it's going to help your heart, so I don't know where that comes from. If it comes from like the alcohol industry, but that's what will be thrown back at me. Yeah. Like, well, no, I need to keep this in here if it's scotch or whatever it is. And maybe for mental health, that aside, but from the physical health.
Yeah. It's like there's a huge literature on the health effects of red wine. Up to even 3-ish glasses a day. I can probably find literature that shows even 4. But if you look at the literature altogether, then 1 to 2 drinks a day is associated with neutral effects and positive effects. I mean, yeah, you can grab recent literature saying any amount of alcohol is bad. It's like, well, let's measure that against the backdrop of research, and it depends on what you're looking at. But red wine would be the classic alcoholic beverage that has more positive literature than negative literature on it. And how did
they come to that conclusion of red wine as opposed to white wine?
They measure risk factors whenever people measure cardiovascular risk, they have to do it observationally. And it's very dicey and it's very sketchy, and you almost have to take it with a grain of salt, especially if there's not this mind-numbing consistency of outcomes that you see over and over. So yeah, red wine kind of takes the cake over white wine in the observational literature for resulting in more favorable cardiovascular outcomes. And even things like, the cancer threat from alcohol, red wine seems to avoid that. And
so my question would be more favorable than not using it at all?
Some literature, yes. Some literature, yes, with red wine. Yeah. But, big picture, 1 to 2 drinks a day in most individuals who don't get addicted and end up doing 1 to 2 bottles a day. There's no, there's no tangible threat to that in the majority of the population. And these things in general, Dave, are hard to study. It's hard to study because you have to follow large groups of people for years and decades and follow disease endpoints and rely on their self-reported intake. And then you have to realize there's a ton of other factors in their lifestyles, both diet and non-diet wise, that would influence these outcomes. So I'm not in the camp that says, you got to go zero alcohol in order to bring your risks down maximally. I don't think that the evidence indicates that.
I would look at it as, if it's a strength athlete or somebody that's on the margins with their macros, either slightly above for a surplus or slightly below for a deficit, if they're going to use red wine, then that's 200 calories, 400 calories that's not being allocated, to other nutrient dense foods, which I would suppose have a higher net positive than 400, I don't want to say empty calories, but 400 of different level, different calories.
Yeah. I mean, from that standpoint, from athletic performance standpoint, that definitely comes into play, because some people get really screwed up with even a couple of drinks. They're feeling like crap the next day. Some people really are affected that much, and alcohol can affect sleep quality, and it can affect appetite too. And so what is typically seen is that alcohol disrupts sleep quality, and when you disrupt sleep quality, your appetite and your craving levels come up. And of course, when you overdo alcohol, then anytime you negatively impact sleep, you're going to negatively impact exercise performance. And so alcohol can be a double whammy in that sense of impacting both appetite in a bad way and training performance in a bad way, because it impacts sleep in a bad way. So there are, if you're somebody who doesn't give a damn about drinking at all, you can take it or leave it, and you have goals of maximizing your training and your body composition outcomes, I would push that person towards just don't even start. Don't, it's not going to make you live longer or better in the end anyway. And look, you look at the blue zones, the so-called, the 5 blue zones of the world, where people are leading everybody else in longevity and health span and lifespan and all that. 3 out of the 5 blue zones consume a moderate amount of alcohol regularly. But it's more of like, look, they're living that long and that well, maybe in spite of their alcohol intake and not necessarily because of it. And there's a certain amount of social bonding and community bonding and psychological potential benefits of that the alcohol intake might facilitate in certain contexts.
Well, with those blue zones, something that I would wonder is, could they potentially live longer if their protein intake was higher? Because typically you're going to find lower protein intakes in those blue zones. Yeah.
I think you can you can always intervene and optimize. You can always build a better cyborg. You can always take somebody from the blue zones, get their protein optimized, get them resistance training, and at 80, 90 years old, they'll be much more fit and robust and ready to possibly live even longer than their counterparts, than their cohorts who didn't optimize protein and resistance train. Mm-hmm. So I think you can always build a better cyborg.
Yeah. Let's take a bathroom break real quick and we'll come back.
Okay.
All right, guys, this is how I use my element packs. I got a few different ways that I use it. So currently just got done training. So post-training, I will mix one of the chocolate. This is the chocolate caramel and my oatmeal. I'm more of a half packet guy. So put about a half a packet in there and then stir it around. Then it adds that salty chocolate taste to it. If for some reason I'm using chocolate protein in my oatmeal, then I won't put that in there. I'll put a half pack in my coffee, which I'm not going to do now, but the chocolate mocha is really good in the coffee. And then for training, when I trained earlier today, it's simply, my favorite is the grapefruit salt. Pretty much just a half pack in there, and then kind of reseal the packs, and then put them in. And then, so for training, I'll have a half a pack, and then half a pack in the oatmeal. So it's about a pack a day. If I'm sweating really bad during training, then I might use a full pack in there. But the go-to for me is the oatmeal because it's an everyday thing. Merck Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to americhealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americhealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk.
Why should anyone join this Discord? Why wouldn't you want to? It's not fake, it's genuine, it's authentic. It's well worth it. The Discord has been nothing short of meeting new people who are incredibly like-minded, giving each other a bunch of ball busting, but also being there to support each other whenever life throws their way. The best part of it for me has also been able to connect with lifters of all levels, help coach, get coached, and also connect with other new fathers who are enjoying the journey of lifting and trying to balance that out. It's the glue that holds all of us together. A common interest will bring people from different walks of life, people who are multimillionaires, these characters and everything else in between, united under one thing, the pursuit of strength.
I think most of us would agree that getting a coach is a great step forward that an athlete can make to make greater progress. But what if you had two coaches? What if you had a whole bunch of coaches and a whole bunch of driven elite level athletes and like-minded people all in your corner trying to make you better? That's exactly what you're going to get with the Table Talk Discord crew.
So we got through protein, carbs, fat, alcohol. So this next question we just kind of brought up during the break. So with your research and the studies that you do, how much of an impact does big nutrition, or whatever we want to call that, have on your research?
Oh man. Okay, so all right.
Funding, grants, from like Kellogg's.
Right. It's like this, man. That's always going to be a question mark, and it'll be a bigger, higher impact question mark depending on the industry. Like for nutrition, it's not a very big question mark, and especially for protein and protein supplementation, for example. Like some of the protein research that my colleagues and I have done was funded by the supplement industry, but we had an a priori agreement that the company has completely hands-off, no say in just the conception of the design of the study, the data collection, interpretation, manuscript writing, publication, no say in any of that. And that's been my experience with industry funding.
So how would it be funded otherwise? Right? Because that's the question that never comes up with the backlash against who's funding these studies, is like, how's that going to work if it's not funded?
Yeah. You just have to kind of, for lack of a better way of putting this, you have to put your faith in the possibility that the researchers conducting this stuff have just basic morals and ethics and not an agenda to fulfill their personal ideologies.
So there's no big protein agenda?
Big milkshake. No. There's no big protein agenda. And, speaking of like just the putting your faith in the integrity of the researchers and stuff, Jeff Volek, you know him as the keto guy, but one of the best designed studies he's ever been the lead on, or at least the corresponding author on, it didn't show any benefit of keto on fat loss in this study where they meticulously matched the protein intakes and total calories. One group was high carb, low fat. The other group was full blown keto. They ran it for 6 weeks. Both of the groups lost essentially the same amount of body fat. And they also tested, they included a comparison arm in there who had exogenous ketones, so supplemental ketones. That didn't show any benefit either. And so this is Jeff Volek, who you would maybe assume built his brand around being the keto guy. But in fact, he's just he's a legit scientist who just wants to find out, who just wants to take the data or take the experiment wherever it's going to go and then follow the data where it leads. And you would just hope and hopefully put some faith in the scientific process that the people doing these studies, dude, nobody's funneling wads of cash into our pockets. Nobody's funneling gold blocks into our accounts,
Bitcoin.
Nobody's cryptoing us, man. And you just have to have some faith in the process. We do this for the love. There's no fringe benefits going on.
So with the flexible dieting approach,
and let me say real quick, I don't know if that's the case with the pharmaceutical industry. I've not been a part of that, but I would almost imagine the bigger the money potential and the more political influence something can have, maybe the greater the chance for shenanigans and bias. But in my observations and in my experience, it hasn't been happening with big protein.
For those who just want to maybe start looking into the science a little bit themselves, because you kind of exist in this difficult middle ground, I feel, where you've got sensationalism on both sides. You've got the media that will take the abstract of a study that's done in a petri dish or whatever and blow that up, and Dave's got a couple of examples for us to go over later. And then you've got the modern age Insta gurus or whatever who will maybe hang on to one study that showed one specific outcome, right? So technically they're not lying, but neither of them are lying technically, So for just those who just want to try and cut through that BS, are there any obvious red flags or issues? Like if someone just went and Googled that study, that, the average person with no science background could just go, no, that's garbage. Or do you know what I mean? Like to help them kind of get their head around not the misinformation, but the misrepresentation of information.
Yeah. And honestly, I wish there was a simpler way for the layperson to do this, but there kind of isn't. So with the PCOS acronym or the PCOS model, you're looking at what population was studied, what's the intervention, like what was the treatment that was done, what are the what was the experimental condition going on? So population, intervention, what was that intervention like that? Let's say protein supplementation. What was it compared with? Like what was the placebo arm? What did that comparator arm look like? And the O is what is the outcome? Like what effect are we anticipating? And then S is what type of study was it? What designed study was it? So with the PICOS acronym, really the biggest snags are going to happen right here at the P, at the level of the population. Was it a human population? Number one. So if it wasn't a rodent population and in fact was a human population, then what kind of humans are we looking at?
Mm-hmm.
Are we looking at sedentary, untrained, straight off the couch? Are we looking at more athletic type of subjects, trained subjects, leaner subjects? All of those things make a difference. And then ICOS, the study type. Study type is another big snag in that observation or in your assessment of whether the study has any sort of relevance and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be, was it a short-term response study
Mm-hmm.
where you're looking at the effects of whatever agent it is over the course of a few hours or 24 hours? Or did you actually drag the experiment out over a period of weeks or months where you can look at bigger changes in, like, for example, body composition? So even like in the protein realm, you can look at short-term muscle protein synthesis response in a given meal. Okay, great, fine. But what really matters is, okay, what happens with changes in body composition and or strength performance over a period of weeks or months? And so, yeah, those are your kind of two things you want to look at. Who's being studied? And then, of course, what was the protocol? Then you look at the protocol. What was the dosing? Is any of that even relevant to what you're looking at? And then study type. Are we looking at, that's interesting type of short-term response thing? Or are we looking at something that measures a little bit more where the rubber meets the road? So, yeah, dude, I mean, that's not an easy answer at all.
So if we take that and apply it to the studies on artificial sweeteners, right? So now you're dealing with quantity, right?
Yeah.
You know, so what do those look like when you dig down into those?
Aspartame's a good one for that one, right?
Yeah. That's a great example, because with artificial sweeteners, you're looking at, okay, population. Okay, mostly rodents. Dose, mostly extremely unreachable amounts by any normal human on the planet. And that is the story with artificial sweeteners, typically. Yeah.
So what would the dose have to be if you were to calculate it all out?
It comes down to gallons, multiple gallons a day, in order for you to incur these types of risks that you see reported in the literature. And, you know, you look at just potential risks on a spectrum, these risk type of agents on a spectrum. And if you were to make a list of them, of ranking order, artificial sweeteners would be like somewhere way at the bottom, way off the list in terms of things that are really going to do human beings in terms of long-term health.
I remember, I think it was one of those studies equated to something like 1,000 cans of Diet Coke a day. But then the other interesting part was I can't remember the scientific terminology for what class of cancer risk they gave it, like the substance, but also in that same category was sunlight.
Yes.
And blue light. So like, are we treating sunlight the same way? And blue light, like everyone's still sat on their phones watching their TVs, but they're demonizing the can of Diet Coke in their fridge. Do you know what I mean? It's just, I think it's interesting how you can we don't cherry pick, I suppose. We get told what to cherry pick or shown what to cherry pick, but the context most of the time is just completely.
It is. And in the same risk category would be alcohol, any kind of alcohol. It might even be in a higher risk category by now. I would have to check that out. And so it's like, we are, and it sucks to say this, but at some point we're going to die of something. And the way that you play your cards throughout your life, people are just kind of looking at the wrong cards. And so artificial sweeteners would be one of those things. And yeah, there is a body of literature showing that artificial sweeteners are associated with X, Y, and Z disease, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, whatever. But a lot of times that is a reverse causality type of scenario where people who are on a trajectory towards that are going, oh, damn, I got to clean up. I got to kick the regular fully leaded, sodas out of here and then substitute it with diet sodas. And then this population is already at risk.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go up in those cards, what are the higher placing cards that people should worry about?
Body composition and physical activity. Okay, so body comp and regular physical activity. So if you're either marching towards a favorable body comp, not obese, or you are obese and you're marching towards getting away from that, that alone is going to cover a large percentage of the big rocks of health. If you are not sedentary, so if you are doing some kind of exercise or recreational movement for most days of the week, that would be a big rock to cover. And then the other big rock comes down to diet quality. Are you consuming a nutritious diet that gives you all of the essential micronutrients and macronutrients that are carried within a decently healthy food selection throughout the course of the week? And then after you've done that, it kind of comes down to, well, are you psychologically okay? Are you, and then of course, I mean, this almost goes without saying. If you don't get enough sleep, you are probably, almost everything is for naught. Sleep is a foundational pillar. And most people are living life burning the candle at both ends. And they do that for multiple decades at a time, from the time they're like 20 to the time they're about 60. And so people who are managing sleep better are going to be managing their training better, and they're going to have less cravings. They're going to be sort of setting things up to be healthier. And so that would be like the big rocks or the cake. Whether or not you're using diet soda to control your intakes or fulfill your cravings or to just kind of help you through the dieting cycle, that really is sort of an individual thing. Now, okay, caveat here. I do know people who have absolutely abused diet sodas. Like, let's imagine one of these babies has 200 milligrams of caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I know some guys who will have 5 of these in a day. That's bad. Okay. So at the population level, so statistically, the maximal amount of caffeine that an adult can consume and be healthy is about 400 milligrams a day statistically. So you're looking at the average person, average size and stuff. So it's entirely possible that somebody can be a very large person with, a lot of use for that caffeine, and it might even help them. So they might be able to go, who knows, 500, 600, at the upper end. But just at the average population level, it does kind of come down to this 400 milligram. If you have 400 grams,
you're going to be dead soon.
You'll die twice.
Yeah.
You can die from 5 to 10 grams. Well, you at least be hospitalized. But 400 milligrams of caffeine seems to be the average upper limit. And with diet sodas, it's easy to accidentally abuse caffeine. Mm-hmm. So yeah, aside from that, yeah.
Do you think for some people, maybe on a subconscious level, then demonizing the aspartame, demonizing whatever the food of the month that the devil is easy? It's them moving a grain of sand rather than moving that big rock because it's easier. Do you think on a subconscious level that plays into it? Like people get obsessed on the smaller, because it's easier to drop Diet Coke than it is to admit that you're eating all the wrong foods, sleeping 4 hours a night, or, whatever the actual problem might be. Do you think that plays into a lot of all of this kind of demonization of food groups and specific nutrients and that type of thing?
I do. And I think it's driven by people's fundamental need to, people have a genuine desire to do what they can within reason to be healthier. But it's also easy to fall into this sort of hypocrisy where you kind of tell people, I never have diet sodas. I cut them out completely, because they're a class 2B carcinogen according to the World Health Organization. Never mind that so is alcohol. And then they're just having alcohol daily, or they're getting tanked every weekend. And so, yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon.
Just like a cherry picking phenomenon.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Well, it's a strong talking point for anybody that wants to put an Instagram reel up.
Yeah.
Right. Avoid this. Boom. It's attention. It's going to grab more attention than exercise and eat better. Right. That's just going to get flipped right through. With staying on some of these topics here that are demonized or not demonized, where would I got all kinds of meathead stuff in here. Cool. So gallon of milk a day. Right? That's like religion across some spectrums.
Yeah, that's really fun. Shout out to Mark Ripito on that. It's super, super duper funny. I could have thought of this word, I don't know, but starting strength, Ripito's starting strength, when you add the gallon of milk a day factor to it, it becomes sharting strength. Yeah. The literature as a whole on dairy is kind of a net positive, I got to say. With the exception of butter, where it's got a consistent literature on butter being inferior to other fat sources for how it impacts your blood lipid profile, your LDL levels, your ApoB levels and stuff. Blood lipids tend to be negatively impacted by butter. But full fat milk products, not so much. And it is really kind of interesting how that works. Even if you look at literature comparing cream with butter, the consumption of that, how that impacts blood lipids. Cream has a neutral effect on blood lipids, while butter raises ApoB levels, or the atherogenic or bad aspect of blood lipid profile. And once again, this is not to say that I'm anti-butter, but there's nuances to the whole dairy question. But on the whole, full fat dairy, as long as your consumption of it doesn't contribute to an ongoing unused caloric surplus by the end of the day or by the end of the week, that allows you to accumulate excessive amounts of body fat and then, precede this cascade of adverse metabolic consequences. Dairy is just fine. So
the same must then obviously be true for chocolate milk as well.
Yeah, chocolate milk, there's no limits. Don't
ruin this for people.
There's no limits to it. As long as it's post-exercise, go straight to the muscles, baby.
We kind of talked a little bit about the intermittent fasting, but that's one that comes and goes a lot, and it's actually a lot, like every few months, back and around. Pros and cons of that.
Sure. Intermittent fasting is a great non-quantitative, non-nitpicky way to control caloric intake. So there is a real interesting aspect of intermittent fasting. So there's basically three basic types of intermittent fasting. There's time restricted feeding, where you restrict when you eat to about like 8 hours or less in the course of a day. And then the other kind of intermittent fasting is twice weekly fasting, or alternate day fasting, which is a little bit more severe in terms of the caloric deficit that you'd incur. So there's basically those three types. A fourth type of consecutive day fasting, where people do like 3-day fast or 5-day fast or something like that. But that isn't studied a whole lot in the literature because, they don't want people passing out and they don't want to shoulder the risks of that sort of thing. So with those types, honestly, all of them show positive effects on both body composition outcomes as well as clinical outcomes, blood biomarkers of health, cardiovascular risk profile and stuff like that. They're all positive because they're all different roads to the same spot, which is controlling caloric intake and mitigating the potential for overeating. That's really the mechanism of intermittent fasting that works so well. And not only that, but with intermittent fasting during the feeding phases, whether it's a day that you're eating a day or the day that you're not fasting, or whether it's the eating window, there is a consistent body of research showing that you can eat ad libitum, in other words, as desired without restricting during the feeding phases and still net a caloric deficit or at least maintenance by the end of the day, by the end of the week. So people who hate tracking and nitpicking, intermittent fasting models are kind of a boon to them.
So of the benefits we see, though, what you're saying is that the benefits we see from all these intermittent fasting protocols are simply as a result of the body composition changes that come with it. And if let's say we did an intermittent fasting experiment where body composition was purposely maintained, we would not expect to see any health marker changes or anything like that as a result of that changing eating strategy.
That's correct. But I have to add some nuance here.
Mm-hmm.
So with time-restricted feeding, where you restrict your eating to like 8 hours in the day, at most, and usually with protocols where somebody eats from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. versus 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., but they're eating the exact same stuff. In short-term studies like that last a day or 48 hours, and in some cases even up to a month-ish, there's better glucose control shown with the early time-restricted feeding model versus the conventional model, or even a delayed or late shifted time-restricted feeding model. It's usually the early time-restricted feeding model that kind of wins for showing better blood glucose control. Okay, so this was in short-term studies though. So when they dragged the comparison out for a year, this was actually a 12-month study that was done pretty recently, where they looked at eating from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. versus eating 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Dragged the study out for 12 months, moderate caloric deficit, no advantage of either group. So, and they diligently, they matched the diets pretty well in terms of macronutrition and calories and all that stuff. And so by the end of the study, both of the groups lost an equal amount of body fat. Both of the groups improved their clinical parameters, blood lipids, blood glucose, etc., equally by the end of the year. And so that tells us that, okay, well, there's different effects in the short term versus the long term with, comparing these two different or actually comparing early time restricted feeding with some conventional type of intake.
So intermittent fasting isn't going to increase my autophagy and make me immortal, is what you're saying.
Okay, so autophagy is...
sorry, that's me saying it the British way, probably. I'm sorry.
That's cool. That's cool. I think the British accent is really cool. And by the way, I just found out that one of my favorite media personalities, Gordon Ramsay, he's not British, he's Scottish, right? Something like that. Most Scottish people, if you called them British, would probably be pretty offended. Yeah, especially Gordon.
Because then you're scooping them in with Englishmen is the problem. Like, I'm Welsh, so if you call me British, that means you're scooping me in with that group too, which I could get offended to if I wanted to.
If you wanted to, yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, so yeah, it's like the intermittent fasting. Autophagy and the whole thing. Okay, so for the listeners, autophagy is a process where the body gets rid of damaged cellular components and frees up some room for better cellular functioning. Okay, and what a lot of folks do is they read about this phenomenon and they go, oh, okay, autophagy, good. So more is better. So what a lot of people don't realize is that you can ramp up autophagy until the point of starvation and death. So it'll flip over to a phenomenon called autosis, and then you're looking at runaway autophagy that leads to death, right? It makes no sense to chase autophagy with fasting. It doesn't. And that's because autophagy is a catabolic process that happens as a component of this symphony of physiological processes that happens in the background anyway. And I like to give the example of chasing autophagy. The ramping up of autophagy is the same thing as somebody who just wanted to ramp up their glucagon or their cortisol all the time. It's like, okay, it happens because of physiological stress, because of undereating. It also, you can ramp up autophagy by exercising, and autophagy gets elevated through any kind of exercise, through resistance training, through endurance training. And so if you're going to chase autophagy, you're almost better off chasing it through exercise than you are through fasting, because at least with exercise, you have a host of positive things that happen body compositionally, fitness-wise, mitochondrially, everything like that. That happen in addition to raising autophagy. But it kind of goes back to my point that if you are fasting thinking autophagy, then if you really wanted to raise autophagy, just proceed to starve to death and you'll really raise it. And it freaking makes no sense. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
But unfortunately, they'll take that word, define it in a way that makes me think, ooh, that sounds good, and then sell whatever eating strategy based. That's why I brought that up, because it gets misrepresented, like everything will get misrepresented to almost use it as a selling point, right?
And these sort of things, intermittent fasting, alternate day fasting, time restricted eating, all that stuff, it's like for some populations, it's not a good option. So somebody who's already lean, and they actually looked at this, this was a study on lean men. I think it was by Templeton. I'm forgetting the author, lead author. But they compared an alternate day fasting regimen in lean men with a conventional daily caloric deficit. So they matched the net caloric deficit by the end of the week in these two groups. And the alternate day fasting group lost more lean body mass by the end of the experiment. So I don't really know why. They both incurred the same net deficit, but apparently, if you're already lean, when you start messing around with fasting protocols, then lean body mass is put more at risk than if you were to run a more conventional type of diet.
I mean, just less fuel available to get through the day, perhaps just from stored body fat, and possibly maybe if they're already glycogen depleted, then what other choice does the body have, I suppose, at that point? Yeah.
Those would be some of the factors.
Because, I mean, the body's not stupid. If you're 6%, I mean, I'm sure they weren't 6% body fat, but if your body fat's already low, it's going to down-regulate everything that breaks down body fat more, because there's a point where it's just going to go, no more.
Sure.
So it's going to resist that and go, well, what's easier now, I suppose.
Right. And it's not always positive things that happen. There are metabolic adaptations that happen with dieting that, that are worth discussing. But
how much of the diet should somebody make up with protein powders as opposed to protein foods? I guess protein powder would be a food too. So
solid protein.
Yeah, solid protein.
Yeah. So protein powders or anything that would constitute a liquid meal usually is less satiating than a solid meal. So with people trying to maximize maximally control hunger and maximize fullness and satiety and stuff, theoretically you wouldn't want to put them on an all liquid protein powder-ish diet. But protein powder, it's a great tool for hitting your protein requirements for both populations, the dieting population, the gaining population, and also the athletic population, and even the clinical population, the sarcopenic bros who are, trying to stave off age-related muscle loss, but don't necessarily have the capacity or the skills or whatever to get in the solid food to do it. So how much in the diet? That's a good question. Not all of it.
Yeah.
Not all of it. And that reminds me of a study that they looked at. So collagen is called this low quality protein because it's an incomplete protein. It's missing tryptophan, etc. But they compared a diet that was half of it was collagen with a mixed protein diet. And the diet that was literally half collagen was able to have the same nitrogen retentive effect. Okay, yeah, nitrogen balance is an old crude model, but nevertheless, same nitrogen retention with the half collagen protein diet versus the mixed protein diet. So, with something like whey, that is a, in quotes, complete protein, you can build a good case, man, for like, you can have a third of your daily protein from whey and probably not worry about sub-optimizing health and things like that. Yeah, that's a good question. Doesn't have a definitive answer. We can only really speculate on it.
What about just supplementation in general? Because, the strength industry, bodybuilding industry is built on supplements, right? Yeah. So just, God, there's so many different things we can go with. So just a multivitamin, let's just go there first. Is with an adequate diet, is that necessary, not necessary?
It's a no-brainer to just do the multi. It is a no-brainer because people who are physically active and people with physical goals and even performance goals, there's going to be a certain degree of restriction and economizing on caloric intake here and there. There's going to be prolonged dieting phases, hypocaloric phases, and people's food selection just at a general level is pretty narrow anyway. And so we're always going to be running a suboptimal amount of micronutrition at various points and even chronically daily. It's kind of a no-brainer. Just take a multi. The downside is virtually non-existent, and the upside of it has been demonstrated in the literature repeatedly and with a range of different populations who are at risk for incurring micronutrient shortcomings. So just take it.
But is there any scope then? So if we say multivitamin, we're talking like generic brand, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Is there any, for average person now, is there any scope or reality to buying the 50 plus female specific with blonde hair who plays tennis multivitamin? Because there's a million different specialized. And at some point you got to ask, is it really a multivitamin when you're excluding some stuff and whatever, but is there really any scope for that? Because there's only going to be so much absorption of whatever is in a multivitamin anyway, right?
Yeah.
So is there really any scope to go beyond that $5 tub of generic multivitamin, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm going to make an analogy that I thought of right now, probably to my own peril. So you can, while it's true that you can have a 7 Series Beamer, like I'm sure Dave has, the Primo loaded one. Or you can just go, like a Honda Accord 2024 model. That is sufficient, but not necessarily all the bells and whistles. And that would be, a multivitamin versus the one that you described with the perfect chemical forms and the perfect this and that and the others. I'll tell you what I do, and this is not terribly scientific. Okay, so a single one-a-day multi is going to come up short in micronutrients that the general population tends to underconsume all the time. Like, for example, it's going to have a low amount of vitamin D, vitamin D3. It's going to have a low amount of magnesium. It's going to have a low amount of potassium. And so it's like, if you were to get all of these things in there, and calcium too, if you were to get all of these things into a single pill, the pill would be like this big. So I actually take 2 multivitamins, but one of them is indeed the old fogey multivitamin that doesn't have iron, because you don't necessarily want to overdose iron every day. And I also take just separate dosing of magnesium, which is just low in the diet for most people anyway. I take vitamin D3. I take, and this is another controversial one, but I do take extra vitamin C, and I take fish oil, and I take creatine. So the general population tends to come up short micronutritionally for just a general health purposes on vitamin D3, magnesium, and omega-3s, and calcium as well. I don't recommend dosing up on calcium pills, because then that can have potentially negative cardiovascular ramifications with the calcification of arteries and all that stuff. But you usually don't see that happen with food sources of calcium. So I would push people more towards food sources of calcium rather than having them dose up on calcium pills. But yeah, that's kind of the long and the short of supplementation. Creatine works for athletes. If you wanted to go more on the fringe and look at the icing on the cake, then you're looking at things like beta-alanine. You're also looking at essential amino acids. Yeah.
With your creatine, are we talking monohydrate?
Yeah.
Yep. And I assume you're, of course, loading that for like 40 grams for a week, right? And then taking 2 grams a day after that. So, I joke, but in reality, like 5 grams a day or 3, or what's your dosing?
Yeah. With creatine, it's kind of interesting because the way that creatine works is loading up your muscle stores with creatine levels. So you're saturating your muscular creatine stores. And so that saturation process, you can either hurry it up by consuming 20, 25 grams of creatine a day for a 7-day period, or you can just take a maintenance dose of about 5-ish grams, and then your tissue stores will be fully loaded with creatine in about a month. So it really depends on the time urgency of how and when you need to be fully loaded with creatine, to where you have a loading phase or you don't. Yeah.
Now, will there be a period of time where your body will adapt to that?
No, not really. No, not really. However, there is research showing that once you're loaded, there's kind of very little difference between people who take creatine just on their training days, whether it's like 3 days a week, 4 days a week, versus taking creatine every day. Creatine is kind of cool because its washout period is pretty long. It takes a little while. It takes 4-ish to 6-ish weeks for you to stop creatine altogether, and for your body's creatine stores to come down to pre-supplementation levels. So even if you take a week off of creatine for whatever reason, you went on vacation and you forgot to bring your bag of white powder.
Yeah.
You didn't want to get profiled at the airport. Then you should be okay. It takes a while for creatine to leave the body.
I think that there's a lot of cool research now showing the other benefits of creatine in terms of like the cognition benefits, like helping with sleep deprivation and memory loss and stuff like that. So would you include creatine as something that maybe non-athletic populations should perhaps be looking at?
There is a huge body of literature now on the non-athletic benefits of creatine. So you've got, like you mentioned, you've got neurocognitive benefits. There's even joint benefits. There is the clinical applications of creatine. It is an emerging area of science that makes me think, wow, there's nothing creatine can't do. So yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned joint health. So with joint health and joint health supplements, what's the verdict on that?
The old glucose and chondroitin supplements from the 90s. Yeah. There's still statistically significant positive effects there. Collagen supplementation shows positive effects consistently.
What kind of dosages are you seeing with collagen to have that positive effect? Because usually people are buying little tablets and pills, right? And it's almost negligible dosing.
Yeah. When you look at the evidence as a whole, it kind of comes down to 8 to 15 grams, which I like to just round up to 10 to 20 grams of collagen a day, where you see these benefits. And the benefits of collagen are wide ranging. I mean, you're looking at all the connective tissue, but also even skin. Skin outcomes too. And so, collagen is kind of an underrated supplement.
Do you think it has, just kind of going down maybe a bit of a rabbit hole there with connective tissues and that type of thing, do you think that should be something that's applied more to the athletic, i.e. PED using population? Because I know a lot of anabolics cause soft tissue structures to be, like tendons, ligaments, etc. The collagen in there doesn't get laid down as effectively. It's malformed to a degree. So in theory then, is collagen supplementation maybe something that PED using athletes should be looking at? Because a lot of the time their soft tissue synthesis rates, or whatever you want to call it, is suppressed. Anyway, is that something that maybe more people should be looking to include in that population, do you think?
I would say yes. And it's one of those things, it's no skin off your back. Do like a scoop of collagen at some point in your day. And it's not a very big scoop either if you're going to go on the lower end, the 10-gram dosing end. But unless you're eating the chicken cartilage and you're chewing the end off the bones, and or you're getting collagen through the diet somehow, it's tough to get that dose through the diet unless you're eating like a nose to tail style of diet. And there's enough literature showing the benefit of that to where it's almost like, hey, if you want to optimize it and you're not eating chicken cartilage for one of your meals in a day, it's not going to hurt. And it's also, like I mentioned, there's literature showing collagen kind of being on par with other proteins, with whey in particular, for muscle related outcomes. And I'm not going to, at this point in the game, say that collagen is on par with whey for muscle hypertrophy or performance and all that stuff. But for non-muscle lean tissues, it just makes sense. I mean, our connective tissue is mostly collagen on our bodies. Our bone is like a third collagen. Nobody has any issues with getting enough calcium to make sure your skeleton is in good health, but everybody throws a hissy fit at the idea of taking in collagen to make sure your joints and connective tissues are good. Of course, anecdotes are like a-holes. Everybody has one, but I've torn my left calf many years ago, and from that point, I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna roll the dice with this damn collagen stuff, and not only I've been pain-free, and of course, there's confirmation bias going in there, but I seem to have stopped aging, man.
Just like that. The reason I ask you that specifically is because, average meathead might look at collagen and be like, my mom takes that for her joints or whatever. But it's like, well, if you're a guy or girl, whatever, is lifting heavy consistently, needs stronger ligaments, tendons, bones for the loads you're lifting, and is perhaps taking performance enhancement drugs that have negative effects on your connective tissues and collagen synthesis, it's almost like a no-brainer. Like, you want your muscles stronger. Do you not want all the stuff that they connect to be stronger as well?
Yeah, it is a no-brainer. And people will do everything in their power to try to dismiss collagen. Like, there's this one study showing that there was no difference in muscle connective tissue building with collagen versus whey. Okay, we looked at muscle tissue, and muscle tissue is like 5% connective tissue at best. Let's compare whey with collagen on joint tissue. Well, we don't have that study because, kind of like from a biological plausibility standpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to compare those two, because collagen would very likely outperform whey in that aspect. So it is a no-brainer. Yeah. If you're a vegan, then you're kind of screwed, because there's no such thing as a plant source of collagen. Yeah. But then again, hey man, vegans make their sacrifices for their ideology. Sure. Yeah.
What have you seen with NAC?
Oh man, you really are going back to the 90s. So, there is some literature on that, and it is positive. I just don't know if the body of literature is deep and consistent enough for us to kind of put NAC on the short list. But yeah, it's an option.
Option for
an option for just, well, see, with there's different routes to N-acetylcysteine, and people have various claims of what they use it for and not, and
which is a lot.
Yeah, it's like, if it's but here's the thing: it's usually included in concoctions of things to where you can't tell whether it is truly the agent that's doing what you want it to do. It's almost like something like when taurine is included in like pre-workout drinks, or tyrosine, when tyrosine is included in pre-workout drinks. It's hard to say whether that's even doing something or whether the diet as a whole is covering that, and you're just getting this sort of placebo effect from knowing it's in there. So yeah, I don't have a great answer for you and NAC.
I mean, I was reading one of your posts the other. I want to make sure we cover this because you coined what's probably my favorite term I've heard for a while, which was collateral fatness.
Yeah.
So if we don't mind, if we can just go down the preconceived notion of having body fat or body weight set points, and do they exist? And if they do, are they physiological or are they behavioral? Or most likely answer is it both? If you don't mind just kind of defining that term for me as well, because I thought that was fantastic. And then if we can kind of go down that.
Sure. Okay. So collateral fattening is researchers just kind of getting cute with their terminology, like that movie Collateral Damage or something like that. So it basically means it's the process of regaining body weight after you've dieted down, after you've ran like a number of weeks or months of just restricting. And then you gain the weight back. The collateral fattening aspect of it is gaining your body fat back and even more than when you started. And the way that happens in theory is by a number of factors, but one of the factors being an excessive loss of lean body mass during the dieting phase while you're losing fat mass. And it's the loss of lean body mass that would set you up for the collateral fattening phenomenon. And that's because the body sort of senses this survival crisis when you lose body mass. So the body's main drive is to survive. It doesn't know that you're dieting to look good at the pool. It thinks that, holy shit, we're starving. We got to do something about this. And so if you're losing a precious resource like lean body mass, then at the end of the dieting cycle, the body has this drive to gain back that lean body mass ASAP. So at the end of the dieting cycle, your appetite is higher if you lost a bunch of lean mass than it would have been if you would have preserved the lean body mass and the body didn't necessarily sense this energy crisis that it has to fix because you got to survive. So that is the collateral fattening phenomenon where you're just gaining the body. I got to get this lean mass back. We got to eat.
And is most of that just all going to be down to kind of ghrelin and leptin and those kind of transmitters playing there? So what about then the idea that people have a set point where they're just like, no matter what I do, I just keep ending up back at, is that cyclical cycle kind of governed by that? Or, is there some kind of inner mechanism where your body finds like homeostasis at a certain weight and actually physically tries to keep you there, if that makes sense?
Yeah. This is a really good question because, so that set point is theoretically a body weight in adulthood that your body is pre-wired genetically to gravitate to. Like no matter what, the set point theory is that you are doomed to this specific body weight that your body likes and gravitates to. Okay, so while that hypothesis does check out with sort of the general sedentary population, it sort of falls apart when you impose lifestyle and habit changes on people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's led to this concept called the settling point.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of set point, it's settling point. And so settling point theory says, while every individual has a different genetic ceiling for how fat they can get and for how lean they can get, that where they settle in between that ceiling and that basement is largely determined by lifestyle and habits.
Yeah.
And not genetics.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you interact with your environment and how you deal with your biology. So everybody has a different tendency for being hangry or hungry or full.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people have different satiety and hunger hormone outputs. And so that is going to influence people regardless.
Mm-hmm.
However, people with obesity are not doomed to obesity because of their genetics, as the set point theory would say. So you can, if you sustain a certain habit for a long enough period of time, then you can actually rewire your biology because you rewired your behaviors and your habits. And you can force a different settling point or set point, depending on that. And there's interesting examples of limits of how fat people can get and how thin people can get. And that is genetically predetermined, even at the, the elite levels, so like I like to give the example of bodybuilders on stage. The how lean they get is largely determined by genetics.
Right.
The person up there who has more striations on their glutes than the other guy didn't necessarily diet harder or longer than the guy who's up there a little bit smoother. So there's genetic limits to that. There's genetic limits to how fat you can get. Across individual women, there's genetic limits to how lean you can get before the menstrual cycle stops, for example. And so those are genetic limits, but general population, you're not necessarily pushing extremes. It's a matter of how you change your lifestyle habits and how you strategize countermeasures to maladaptive behaviors if your environment is obesogenic.
Yeah. So, there's a range, and then let's say this person always ends up at 250. It's like, that's because you live the life of a 250 pound person. You eat, move, behave or whatever. And if you change that, then sure, maybe you can't be 200 pounds and 5% body fat, but you can certainly be 210, 220 or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And there's many, many examples of people who at one phase in their life for even decades, they were a certain body composition. And then even at the later part, the tough part, the middle age, 35, 45, 55, where life is just insane. Hey, for some odd reason, they were supposed to, get fatter and less healthy, but for some odd reason, it's habits. They were able to improve their body composition and health and stay there. So the set point theory it's kind of been blown out of the water by the settling point.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned hormones there a few times.
Yeah.
So if we can go down the rabbit hole for a moment of it's not about calories, it's about hormones, gurus, and how, if you do this and get your hormones in line, then you can eat whatever you want and everyone's going to be jacked. And as always, the truth is pretty much bang down the middle, right? But if you can just kind of go down why that is true and also why it isn't true in so many ways as well.
Yeah, like people mistakenly separate calories from hormones when you can't, because the hormone side of the thing is always going to be there. You're always going to have a degree of hunger hormones that come up when you're dieting, and satiety hormones that go down when you're dieting, and the opposite will happen on a seesaw if you're not dieting or if you're gaining. So you can't separate hormones from calories, number one. Certain hormones like thyroid, for example, they directly affect how much calories you burn on a 24-hour basis. Okay, so if somebody has lower thyroid activity, then they're going to have a lower resting metabolic rate. but it kind of comes down to like hormones or caloric balance can actually directly affect hormonal balance.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can't separate them. One of the things that is talked about a lot with the concept of hormones and calories is how insulin affects the whole thing. And a lot of people have built their careers around, okay, just focus on insulin because calories don't count. I find that to be, well, it's incorrect. Okay, just to be polite, it's incorrect. There's a lot of folks who say, calories don't count. Yeah, that whole calorie thing is baloney. The calories don't exist. But when you fast, make sure you don't eat any calories. So it's like, bro, what? What? And then keto also comes into that picture too, because a lot of proponents of keto just say, you know what? I was a meticulous calorie counter. Didn't go anywhere. I was miserable. Then I went to keto, stopped counting calories, and it worked. Therefore, calories don't count. Well, here's the reality. In every study that we look at, we take somebody who was doing the standard Western diet, which is, low protein, high carb, high fat combo, highly hyper palatable, mostly processed, highly processed type foods, get them on keto. What happens is their protein doubles. They're finally eating enough protein, and the options for junk food and these sabotaging foods that are out there in the environment, they kind of go down to close to zero. And the key way that keto works for weight loss, fat loss, etc., is you're finally eating enough protein, but you are consuming anywhere from, in the literature, 400 to 900 calories less than you were on your habitual diet.
Yeah.
So it still comes down. Still comes down to calories. So like it kind of goes like this: the road to the gate. There's many different things that influence the road. Let's say the gate is weight loss. All right. So there's many different things influencing the road to the gate. There's hormonal factors, there's lifestyle factors, there's genetic factors, environmental factors. But ultimately, to cross the gate to weight loss, there has to be a caloric deficit that goes on. And look, there's nuances to this. We're talking about substantial weight loss over the long term for people who need to lose it. The energy balance equation doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. And it doesn't necessarily apply like hardcore every time, because recomposition can happen in individuals who start training from a state of being untrained or a state of being overfat or both. So you take an overfat beginner, they can be in no caloric deficit whatsoever, but they're gaining muscle and losing body fat at the same time. So there is that phenomenon that I want to qualify this whole calorie in, calorie out weight thing. It mainly applies to just large amounts of weight loss over a long period of time for people who need to do it. But indeed, recomposition can happen outside of energy balance. So yeah, it gets odd. It gets a little complicated.
But would it be fair to say, like, for the other 98% or whatever, like, it is calories in versus calories out? But hormones change what that equation actually looks like. Like if you're hypothyroid, getting less calories in than is going out is going to be harder because the calories out part of the equation is going to be smaller, which means dieting is going to intrinsically be harder for you. If you've got someone who's got a poor kind of issue or whatever with leptin or ghrelin or whatever, so you get a lot of hunger and stuff. Like, it doesn't change. It just means it's harder to be in that deficit, or whatever the situation might be.
So an example that you just gave with thyroid. So the average person with Hashimoto's hypothyroiditis, okay, so their resting metabolic rate is going to be like 7 to 10% lower than a healthy person. And so with that condition, they're also going to be less energetic, more lethargic. And so you have this disadvantage of resting metabolic rate burn like 200 calories less than a healthy counterpart. And then you have their lethargy, their non-exercise activity might be another 200 to 300 less per day. So you've got this 500 calorie disadvantage in this person with the hormonal issue. Yeah. So that's just sort of an example how you can't separate the two. Yeah.
Doesn't that same disadvantage happen if somebody's dieting for a long period of time?
Yeah.
Right? Because you start living from meal to meal and just like watching TV and training, and that's it.
Yep. It's a phenomenon. It's called, it's mistakenly called adaptive thermogenesis, when it should be called adaptive thermoreduction. And some people in the space know it as metabolic adaptation. Okay. And so this can be as high as, it can run into triple digits calorie wise with people who are pushing the extremes of it. So like, for example, the contestants of the Biggest Loser contest, their metabolic adaptation, if we were to define metabolic adaptation as a drop in resting metabolic rate beyond what would be attributable to losses in lean mass. So anytime you lose lean mass, your RMR will go down. But metabolic adaptation, or this so-called adaptive thermoreduction, is drops in resting metabolic rate that go beyond losses in lean mass. So the metabolic adaptation of the Biggest Loser subjects was enormous. It was like close to 500 calories. And people use that population as an example of, see, you're going to be screwed out of 500 calories just from dieting. But no, that was an extreme population. So if we look at the general population who's dieting even severely for months, their metabolic adaptation is in like the double digits of calories, like 50-ish calories by the end of the dieting cycle. In bodybuilders, competitive physique athletes, their metabolic adaptation does go into the triple digits, but not to this deal-breaking idea to where you can say, your metabolism is broken. So we're looking at 100, 160, 200 calories most of metabolic adaptation in extreme dieters. So in the general population, that metabolic adaptation is mainly going to come from a drop in non-exercise activity. So not necessarily their resting metabolism.
So when you're talking there about the actual adaptation, you were talking about kind of the downregulation of the thyroid, T4, T3 conversion stuff, right? So what you're saying
that
is
plays a part, hypothetically.
So that part, what you're saying is that isn't really the problem most people are encountering. It's the fact that, okay, you were 250 and now you're 220. When you do your 10,000 steps a day, you're carrying 30 less pounds. Chances are, you might have been that person who used to sit there and fidget their leg, whatever, all that couldn't stay still. Now you're not doing that. And, all those little subconscious things that you don't even, that's actually what's contributing to that downregulation.
That's exactly correct. It's the lower cost of moving around a larger body combined with a drop in non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or we call it NEAT. And drops in NEAT on average at the end of a dieting cycle can be as high as 200 to 300 calories a day. And so that adds up. Yeah.
Were there any topics you wanted to talk about we didn't bring up?
I just wanted to say how amazing it is to be here. I've been following you since 2007, you and Jim, and the whole elite crew. It's like, this is definitely it's a highlight of my career. I've been at this shit since I've been at this good stuff since
a while,
1992. And so that's like 32 years. And so it is just honor, privilege, everything. It's just so great to be here.
No, I thank you for coming out. Thank you. What's the best way for people to find you?
AlanAragon.com. And on social media, I'm at the Alan Aragon.
Yeah, I highly recommend you subscribe to his research journal. I've been on it forever. Every month, there't 4 or 5 different things that you're reviewing. I don't read them all, right? But I skim through. There's a lot, man, but I'll skim through all that. And I will also echo that I do believe that you were the first to be able to have those. And there's a handful of them now. And to me, it's still the go-to one to be able to go to. So we'll have a link in the description, and thank you for coming out, and we're done.
Thank you so much, guys. Really.
Thank you.
America Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to americahealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americahealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk.
Why should anyone join this Discord? Why wouldn't you want to? It's not fake, it's genuine, it's authentic. It's well worth it. The Discord has been nothing short of meeting new people who are incredibly like-minded, giving each other a bunch of ball busting, but also being there to support each other whenever life throws their way. The best part of it for me has also been able to connect with lifters of all levels, help coach, get coached, and also connect with other new fathers who are enjoying the journey of lifting and trying to balance that out. It's the glue that holds all of us together. A common interest toward being people from different walks of life, people who are multimillionaires, these characters and everything else in between, united under one thing, the pursuit of strength.
I think most of us would agree that getting a coach is a great step forward that an athlete can make to make greater progress. But what if you had two coaches? What if you had a whole bunch of coaches and a whole bunch of driven elite level athletes and like-minded people all in your corner trying to make you better? That's exactly what you're going to get with the Table Talk Discord crew.
Today's episode is brought to you by Element, a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything that you need and nothing that you don't. In other words, no sugar, no artificial coloring, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, and no BS. With Element, I love the watermelon. The watermelon tastes freaking awesome. I drank 1 pack every day, no matter what. People that train out here, it's sitting out here for them all the time. The boxes don't last very long. Right now, Element is offering Table Talk listeners a free sample pack with any purchase. That's 8 single serving packages free with any Element order. Get yours at drinkelement.com/table talk. The deal is only available through the link in the description. The other thing is, if you don't like it, you can just give it away to a salty friend and Element will give you a 100% refund. No risk, money back guarantee. Head over to drinkelement.com/table talk.